Welcome, dear listener, to another quiet journey into the slow, drifting corridors of the past. Tonight, we will wander north, into lands where the winters are long, the nights stretch endlessly, and snow lies heavy upon the earth. This is the world of the Vikings, a people often remembered for their ships, their raids, and their sagas, but who also lived, quietly and persistently, through winters that tested the very edges of human endurance. Before we settle into this story, I invite you to take a deep breath. Allow your body to relax into stillness. If you have not already, please subscribe, so you may continue to join me on these calm historical wanderings. Now, let us step softly into the flickering light of the Viking longhouse, to explore how they survived the Arctic winters, not with fireplaces as we know them, but with ingenuity, patience, and the warmth of community. The heart of Viking winter survival was the longhouse, a structure that stood not merely as a shelter but as a lifeline, binding families and communities together through months of cold and darkness. Imagine a long, narrow hall, its walls constructed from stout timber, sod, or stone, and its roof thickly layered with turf or thatch. These homes stretched anywhere from 15 to 75 feet in length, with a central passage and raised wooden platforms along the sides where families would sit, work, eat, and, most importantly, sleep. The design of the longhouse was deliberate, shaped by generations of experience with unforgiving winters. The sod roof was not simply a matter of convenience. It was a natural insulator. In the deep silence of a northern winter, snow would accumulate on the roof, adding yet another layer of insulation, sealing the warmth within while muffling the sounds of the outside world. Inside, the air would often be smoky, the smell of charred wood and drying fish lingering. Yet it was warmth, the difference between survival and perishing, unlike the fireplaces familiar to later European homes. The Vikings relied instead on the central hearth, an open fire pit sunk into the floor of the longhouse. It provided light and heat, though imperfectly. The smoke would drift upwards, blackening the beams overhead before seeping through gaps in the thatch or vents left deliberately open. It was not a system of comfort by modern standards, but it created a livable environment where families could endure the deep freeze outside at night. Families and even livestock often shared the same enclosed space. Cattle, goats, and sheep were brought inside not only to shield them from the cold, but also to add their body heat to the house. The breath of both humans and animals mingled in the smoky air, and the lowing of cows or the shifting of sheep became part of the winter lullaby. Such close quarters created challenges, odors, disease, and crowding, but also ensured that the temperature inside the longhouse remained many degrees warmer than the biting winds outside. Life revolved around this central space. Men repaired tools, women spun wool or wove cloth, children carved toys, and elders told stories that reached back through centuries. In the absence of modern diversions, the longhouse became both hearth and theatre, workshop and sanctuary. The sagas, those sprawling tales of gods, heroes, and voyagers, likely gained much of their life during such winters, told and retold beside the glowing coals. The longhouse was not a grand palace. It was practical, even austere. Yet in its beams and boards, in its sod-packed walls, it contained the spirit of survival. Without the longhouse, there would be no Viking Age as we know it. It was the place where frost-bitten fingers thawed, where bread was baked, where the sound of wind became muted and softened, and where the Vikings waited patiently for the return of the sun. In the deep stillness of winter, warmth begins not with the fire but with the fiber that rests against the skin. Long before the word insulation had a technical meaning, the Vikings understood it intuitively. Warmth is a slow conversation between the body and what it touches, a gentle trapping of breath and heat in tiny pockets between threads. If the longhouse was the outer shell of survival, their clothing was the inner sanctuary. It was not merely things to wear, but a layered architecture designed to hold life close to the body through weeks when the sun was a rumor and the wind unraveled. Through every seam of the world. First came linen, spun from flax in quieter seasons when hands were free to prepare for the cold ahead. Linen was the layer that kissed the skin, light yet strong, a soft intermediary between living flesh and the heavier armors of winter. The weave could be plain and practical, woven on looms that stood against the beamwork of the house, threads counting time in a language of warp and weft. Linen absorbed sweat and kept the wearer's skin dry, for dryness is a cousin to comfort when the cold seeks any advantage, any damp corner to make its home. Over this base, the Vikings turned to wool. Wool was the kingdom of warmth, a subtle miracle of crimped fibers and tiny air chambers, a softly breathing barrier that held the heat of the wearer even as the world asked for it back. They had less need for elaborate theory, for the sheep taught it well enough by example. Lanolin rich coats that shed moisture, fibers that rebounded from compression to trap air once more. Wools varied like the winter sky, thick or fine, rough or surprisingly soft, undyed or dyed with colors raised from a careful garden of plants and lichens, madder reds, woad blues, weld yellows, and 100 earth-quiet shades between. The woolen garments were not simply clothes. They were designed for the tasks of survival. Tunics and dresses with sleeves that could be rolled as hands worked. Shawls that could be pulled closer as the night deepened. Heavy cloaks with brooches that fastened them snug at the shoulder, the fabric falling like a portable wall against the wind. Heavier weaves were reserved for outer layers, lighter weaves for inner comfort. Felted wool, thick and dense, was coaxed into shapes that resisted both cold and wet, caps that hugged the head and shared their warmth with the ears and brow, mittens that sat like small hearths over the hands, boots lined to keep toes awake and unafraid. Fur was the dialect of the truly brutal nights, when the wind's logic turned razor clean and the air emptied itself of mercy. Fur-lined hoods and collars, cuffs and hems, sometimes entire overgarments edged or backed with the pelts of animals that had already learned the winter's script by heart. There was no luxury in it, only efficiency, the swift reassurance that every breath taken would not leave the ribs shivering or the bones ringing. The ethical calculus of survival is older than any later judgment. In those months, every craft served the preservation of families and the quiet continuation of work, song, and story. Hands and feet required special care, for warmth escapes most eagerly from the edges. Here the arts turned careful and ingenious. Shoes might be of leather treated with animal fats and beeswax, made water-resistant by ritual applications performed before the frosts came hard. Socks could be nail-bound, made by a looping technique older than knitting, with a sturdy, slightly elastic density that suited the cold and resisted unraveling. Under them, plant fibers or dried grasses could be layered to wick moisture away from skin. Mittens, too, might be nail-bound, close-fitting, and capable of repair when they wore thin at the palm. For nothing is so friendly to the cold as a tear left unattended, and then the head, a quiet crown once the wind rises. Caps of wool, sometimes with ear flaps, sometimes simple and close, sometimes layered under hoods. A hood pulled forward narrows the world in front, but it deepens the well of warmth inside, the breath rebounding from cloth in small, fog-soft clouds that warm the cheeks and the nose. Scarves and neck warmers served as dams against the entry points of chill air, and if they bore a little decoration, a pattern of geometric lines, a memory of a dye vat's patient colors, it was a reminder that survival could be orderly. Even beautiful in its restraint, clothing was maintenance, an ongoing conversation rather than a finished act. Each day carried small rituals: shake out the snow and ice from hems and cuffs, hang garments near, but not too near, the central coals, turn them so the damp evaporates evenly, reapply fats to boots when leather shows thirst. A wool cloak left damp will betray you the next morning. A sock with a hidden rough place will make a blister, and a blister in winter is a small door left ajar to the cold. So they patched and mended, stitched and smoothed, strengthening elbows and knees where the friction of life wore the fabric thin, passing needles through cloth by lamplight while voices drifted from bench to bench. This was not merely the work of women or the work of men. It was the work of households. Children learned early to twist a cord, to tie a simple knot that kept a mitten at the wrist. Adolescents learn how to measure a shoulder with a glance and guess the length from collar to hem. Elders watched and said, "Thicker there," or "that seam will not hold," their experience a kind of second warmth that kept waste at bay. The longhouse was thus a wardrobe in the old sense, not a room of garments but a collection of skills gathered under one roof, where knowledge itself was a kind of insulation, packed into the family's days like straw in the cracks of a wall. When storms rose and the world vanished into white, the layers did more than keep the cold out. They allowed life to go on. A man could walk to the byre and check the livestock without returning stiff and silenced. A woman could carry water, churn butter, or step outside to gather snow for melting without biting her lip against the taste of wind. Children, bundled to nearness, could play briefly along the lee side of the house, their laughter just audible through wool and the swaddled air, then tumble back inside, shedding wrappings like dry leaves until they were only their small, warm selves again. It is tempting to romanticize these layers, to imagine them all rich with dye and woven in elaborate patterns. There was beauty, yes, but also restraint. Winter garments were often plain, their elegance resting in the evenness of the weave and the careful alignment of seams. A strip of tablet weaving at a hem conversed with a brooch-rented gleam. A line of decorative stitching along a collar seemed like a quiet smile. Ornament lived where it did not interfere with function, and function reigned like a gentle, necessary sovereign. Clothing intersected with diet, with labor, with rest. Warmth held by wool is more steadfast in a body fed by fats and grains. A cloak sits better on a back that has slept sufficiently. A mitten warms faster on a hand that has not just plunged into icy water. So the garments were part of a system, the cooking, the sleeping arrangements, the order of chores, the timing of tasks, all turned toward the single goal of keeping the household balanced in a season that sought to tip everything into stillness. In such a system, a well-mended sock could be as important as a well-timed meal. A carefully dried cloak, as crucial as a well-stoked ember. By the time the winter's middle weeks unfolded, that long stretch where days can feel indistinguishable, where the sun skims like a cautious bird along the horizon, the household's clothing had softened to the shape of those who wore it. A cloak remembered the shoulder it sat upon. A mitten had learned the curve of a palm. A cap had grown fond of a brow. The garments were not only protection but companionship, like quiet guardians that asked for little and gave what they could, hour after hour, breath after breath. Someday, the winds would ease. The crust of snow would weaken, and water would speak again in its own tongue. The linen would feel too warm while turning soil for spring plantings. Wool tunics would be lifted away and replaced with lighter ones, and furs would retreat to chests where the scent of smoke and fat and winter would sleep until needed again. But in the long weeks when the world narrowed and the cold had logic on its side, the Vikings survived not through a fireplace with a neat mantle and a tidy flue, but through layers, layers spun, woven, stitched, and worn, the quiet architecture of warmth that let life continue in the fiercest season. In winter, a home is a larder, a lamp, and a low, steady breath. In the Viking world, this breath came from the central hearth. Not a bricked fireplace with polished mantel and tidy chimney, but an honest rectangle or oval of stones set into the packed earth. A cradle for embers that glowed like a small constellation indoors. Around that glow the winter kitchen arranged itself, quiet and deliberate. The work of feeding a household began months earlier in the company of sun and wind. And by the time snow deepened and daylight thinned, it was less about cooking than about stewarding, releasing the summer's patience in measured portions so warmth could move from pot to body. From body to sleep, from sleep to the next morning's tasks, preservation was the first ingredient of every winter meal. The Vikings salted with care when salt was at hand. They dried with greater frequency, coaxing water out of fish and meat until what remained was light, dense, and unwilling to spoil. Strips of fish, cod especially, became stockfish, transformed by wind and cold into food that waited calmly for weeks and months. Meat could be smoked in the seasons when smoke could be spared. And when the work of slaughter and harvest converged, brines were made in tubs and casks, liquid winter jackets that held pork or mutton in their mineral embrace. Grain was not merely stored. It was guarded like a quiet treasure in chests and bins, and, at times, in small pits lined and sealed against damp and curious creatures. Fermentation lived everywhere. A helpful chemistry that did not ask for glass or gauges, only for patience, clean vessels, and the memory of how things should smell when they are becoming useful. Milk became cultured, soured, churned, or coaxed into escaroe-like curds that held a tart, sustaining comfort. Whey, never wasted, became both ingredient and preservative, and sometimes a drink in its own right. Vegetables, where they could be grown and gathered, were salted, souring gently in brine until they offered brightness on a day that had none at the window. Cabbage, turnip, beet, and the sturdy roots that knew how to sleep underground were kept in cool corners, in lidded pits, or near earthen walls where the temperature stayed moderate and the air did not trouble them with sudden changes. Grain was the quiet center. Barley and oats, sometimes rye, absorbed water and returned warmth. Porridge could be a morning, noon, and evening thing, altered by what went in, a ladle of buttermilk or a spoon of tallow, a pinch of herbs dried and saved from autumn's last green, a shred of dried meat softened in liquid once more. Bread, too, bore winter's logic. Flatbreads cooked on stones warmed at the edge of the hearth, or on an iron plate when such a plate was in a household. Raised loaves existed where sour culture was tended. Elsewhere, dense cakes and thin rounds traded lofty crumb for shelf-stable calm. Each variant obeyed the same law: feed the family, spend little fuel, keep the embers alive. The hearth was measured in layers: flame, coals, ash, and each layer had its use. Flames were for a quick boil, a sudden need. Coals for steady cooking. Ash, sifted and soft, for insulating a pot or for baking roots slowly, secretly, until their starches turn tender and sweet. To cook on coals is to listen to time itself, to feel when a pot needs turning, when a log must be nudged so that heat continues to travel without flaring. A cauldron hung from a simple iron hook or a wooden tripod could be lifted a hand's breadth higher if the stew asked for patience, lowered if the day demanded speed. Soapstone vessels, where they existed, held heat with a generous steadiness and tolerated the closeness of coals without complaint. Oil was scarce. Fat was precious. Tallow lamps gave light with a scent that was part of winter's catalogue, a small flame coaxed from rendered life, carefully shielded from draughts. Light like this behaves in slow circles. It touches the edges of bowls and the curve of a spoon and stops. Cooking in such light was less a performance than a ritual. A pot of barley stew breathed gently. A pan of fish, the flesh rehydrated and then simmered, asked for watchful quiet until it went from taut to willing. When the work was done, the wick was trimmed, and the lamp's small eye blinked down. Leaving the house to the memory of glow water, in its own way, was cooked too. Snow was gathered and melted into drink. Ice, chipped from a barrel or pond and brought home, contributed coolness and the need for care. Boiling was not only for soups and porridges. It was a kindness to water itself, a safeguard in a world where wells could age badly under ice. Brewing ale was more than celebration. It was water's winter guardian. A weak ale, small beer, could be safer than a jug drawn raw from the earth, and the malted grain that fed it came from the same store that became bread. Mead, where honey was available, warmed not just the tongue but the pace of evening, adding a softness to conversation that felt like another layer laid gently over the room. The pantry, a word that in winter included rafters, beams, corners, and any hook that could hold a string, was a map of promises. From the beams hung bundles of herbs grown in the late brightness of summer: angelica, dill, yarrow, and the small green confidences that waited lightly for their turn in a pot. From pegs and lines hung dried fish and meat, each piece gradually turning from something once quick to something carefully long-lasting. Sacks held grains. Crocks held curds, butter, and souring vegetables. Skins held liquids where casks could not. Each vessel had a story of how it came to the household, traded, saved, made, and each had a future in the mouths of those who slept within the house's turf-warmed walls. The rhythm of winter meals followed the rhythm of the work. Morning invited porridge, spooned thick and patient, giving hands something to push against as they began the day. Midday, when the cold can be cruelest, asked for hot liquid, broth, stew, or even a thin soup enriched with fat that left a soft sheen upon the lip of the bowl. Evening returned the household to the hearth. Where slow dishes had deepened without oversight, a pot in the warm ash, a covered pan nested at the coal's rim, a bundle of roots tucked like sleeping animals near the heat. To eat was to be reminded that summer's hours, spent in preparation, still had a voice in winter. Fuel economics shaped every bite. Wood was not always abundant, and in the north the line between prudence and scarcity could be narrow. Fires were banked, not blazed. Embers preserved under a pup tent of ash so morning did not begin in darkness. A single good log might be split into a symphony of uses: thick pieces for steady heat, thin slivers for quick persuasion, chips for courting a stubborn spark. Dried dung, in some places, played its part, trading clean flames for endurance and respect. Whatever the fuel, the kitchen did not roar. It spoke in a hush, in a language of control that deferred to the season's demand that nothing be wasted. Not warmth, not time, not hope. Hospitality did not hibernate. When neighbors came through the door in the grey afternoon, shaking the snow from their cloaks, a bowl was made for them too. The winter kitchen enlarged itself as kindness requires. An extra ladle to a guest. A heel of bread warmed directly on the edge stones. A dollop of butter saved for moments when the house needed a reminder that richness still existed. Children learned that sharing was not a holiday but a habit. Elders taught, by example, that the softening of a guest's face over a hot bowl could change the weather inside the house. Even if the wind outside would not be argued with, tools bore the memory of many winters. Wooden spoons blackened slightly at the tips. Iron knives kept a careful edge, passed over whetstone in strokes the hand knew without looking. The board that served as kneading ground showed shallow valleys where palms had pressed dough season after season. A ladle's handle fit the fingers like a name long spoken. When something cracked or failed, repair came first, replacement second. Stitching, riveting, wedging, these were winter verbs just as much as simmering and stirring. For a pot saved was fuel saved, and fuel saved was time borrowed back from the cold, and always the senses guided the work more than measures. The sound of a pot that has just begun to whisper. The way steam curls when thickening begins. The scent that says dried fish have crossed the thin line from stiffness to readiness. Even the air near the floor spoke, colder and denser, asking for rugs and straw laid where feet will stand to knead or stir. The kitchen's knowledge was mostly unwritten and entirely embodied, carried in hands and noses and tongues, in the slow triangulation between heat, time, and the will of ingredients. In such a kitchen, survival did not feel like defiance. It felt like cooperation with everything that had been prepared when the fields were green. The hearth's small galaxy kept turning. A spoon circled a pot. A child circled the table. An elder circled a story back to the place where the hero learns patience, and the household circled the seasons, the long ellipse that would eventually bring them into spring once more. When the day's work was done, lids settled. Embers were tucked under their blanket of ash. The house exhaled. Outside, the winter, unchanged and enormous, pressed its face gently to the small, smoked window. Inside, the pantry's promises remained intact, and the people slept with warm bellies, ready to wake into another day they had already prepared. Night, in the far north, is not simply an absence of light. It is a season unto itself, a long, slow-breathing animal that curls around the house and waits. To survive it, the Vikings learned to treat sleep as a craft. The longhouse offered no formal fireplaces with brick mantels and tidy flues. Only the central hearth and the wisdom of arrangements. Wooden platforms raised from the earthen floor. Bedding layered with purpose. Bodies placed in patterns that conserved heat and calmed the mind. In the hush that follows the evening's last chores, the house rearranged itself into a nest. Along the longhouse walls ran benches, broad enough to sit and work upon by day and to sleep upon by night. Some were permanent platforms with storage chests tucked beneath. Others were planked beds, simple but sturdy, polished by generations of backs and blankets. Height mattered. A few handspans above the floor could mean several degrees more warmth, as cold air pooled low like water. The platforms also spared sleepers from drafts that sneaked under doors or through gaps in wall planks, and from the damp that an earthen floor might exhale in the deepest weeks of winter. Bedding was a practice of layers, much like clothing. Closest to the boards came something that tamed hardness and trapped air: straw, hay, or rushes refreshed as needed. Sometimes stuffed into ticks, simple fabric cases that could be shaken out and aired on the rare clear day. Over these went woolen blankets or woven coverlets, perhaps a pelt or two where the cold insisted. The order was not arbitrary. Each layer had a job. The plant matter breathed and insulated. The wool held warmth and wickered moisture. The fur returned the favors it owed the animals that had worn it first: edge warmth, quick comfort, the swift quieting of shivers. Families slept in constellations. A married pair might share the warm center of a blanket while small children were gathered just beside, tucked where adult heat would leak most generously. Elders, who feel the cold's fingers sooner, might be placed away from the draught of a door and closer to the hearth's gentle exhalations. Infants, when present, were kept with a vigilance that modern sleep manuals would recognize: near, warm, but guarded against coverage that could slip too heavily. A wooden cradle pulled close and rocked with a foot under the blanket. A hand cupped across a small chest to read the steady tide of breaths. In such arrangements, the space between people became as valuable as the blankets over them, a soft corridor where warmth traveled and returned. The longhouse breathed too. Smoke from a central hearth drifted up and sought its exits through the roof's seams or a deliberate vent, its path changing with the weather's mood. The day's last stirring of the fire was a careful thing. Coals banked under ash so the morning would inherit their glow, not their smoke. In the quiet hours, the air held a mix of scents that winter never quite forgot: wool faintly lanolin-scented, wood warmed by the day's work, a whisper of tallow, a thread of smoke that had kissed every beam and beam end. These were not perfumes of luxury. They were the house's diary, written on the air. There was, often enough, company of a different kind. Livestock, especially in harsher climates or leaner years, spent nights within the longhouse or in a byre attached to it. The separation might be a half wall, a low partition, or simply a practice distance. The animals' breath rose in gentle clouds. Their bodies gave off a steady, dignified heat that softened the room's edges. The closeness brought duties: bedding to be changed, manure to be managed, water to be kept from freezing. But as anyone who has wintered with animals knows, the comfort of their presence is old and practical. The longhouse's warmth came not only from fire and fabric but from pulse and rib and flank. Sleep itself followed winter's logic. In a world before gaslight and switch-flick brightness, nights were often biphasic, 2 sleeps with a gentle waking in between. After the early portion of the night, some roused halfway, perhaps to tend the coals, to check a child, to turn the straw in a spot that had compacted, or simply to sit and listen, the wind's slow arguments along the roof, the reassuring creak of timber that stretched and settled, the occasional soft stamp from the animals. In that intersleep hour, story sometimes walked quietly from one mouth to another. A prayer was said. A bit of mending was finished with a lamp turned low. Then, sleep returned like a friend who had only stepped outside for a moment and remembered to come back. Not all nights were equally peaceful. There were coughs that tried to claim the room, bones that ached from the day's carrying, minds that worried their way along problem threads, a thinning grain bin, a ewe that seemed off her feed, a crack in a roof beam that had deepened with the last storm snow. For these, the household had its winter remedies as much for the mind as for the body: warm broth before bed, a small turn of mead, herbs hung near the sleeping place so that their faint scent might stitch a steadier breathing. A lamp, trimmed low, offered a small, watchful eye against the dark. Comfort, then, was not luxury. It was strategy. To quiet a cough was to protect sleep. To protect sleep was to guard tomorrow's strength. Privacy as we conceive it now was rare. But intimacy, of the honest, practical kind, was abundant, the shared knowledge of who turned most in their sleep, who needed a knee supported by a rolled cloak, which child reached out in dreaming and must be gently placed back under cover. Silence was a skill. The careful lift of a blanket to slide out and tend the coals without waking the cluster. The soft, habitual placing of a wooden ladle upon a shelf so it would not clack and startle anyone back into the cold wakefulness the body resists so much in winter. Cleanliness made warmth more efficient. Bedding, though heavy and slow to dry in winter, was shaken often and aired when the sky allowed. Straw was turned so that dampness did not gather and steal heat. Lice and fleas, those small opportunists of all ages, were an ongoing campaign managed with combs, with heat, with the occasional scalding wash of seams and hems on a day when the fire had been encouraged for that purpose. To sleep unbitten is to sleep deeper. To sleep deeper is to keep the house's work from thinning the next day. On some nights, the longhouse received visitors, kin from a neighbouring farm, a traveller caught by weather, a widow living alone until spring allowed easier exchange. The sleeping plan flexed like a living map. A place was found. A blanket offered. A little spot closer to the hearth made for the person stiff with the cold that had gnawed their joints on the road. Hospitality was warmth distributed in a different pattern. It stretched the cover not only across bodies, but across relationships, stitching villages together so that winter could not pick them off one by one. Children learned the grammar of night early, how to tuck their feet into the warm pocket that a parent's knees could make, how to place their cap so it would be found in the morning without sending the whole bench into searching chaos, how to whisper so only the intended ear would receive the sound. They learned the names of the house's night noises, the small clicks of cooling wood, the sigh of a draft closing after a door had been better wedged, the heavier breath of a cow deep in sleep. Knowledge like this, of place and pattern, is its own blanket. There were nights of weather that pressed hard. The roof thudded with new snow. The door protested at the drift that piled like a shore against it. Such nights taught the value of redundancy, extra pegs for hanging damp cloaks so they would not chill sleeping places, a reserve of dry rushes set aside for emergency bedding refresh, a rod and hook kept near so that coals could be managed without crossing the room in cold. When morning came after such a siege, the first foot to the floor found it with a cautious test. Then, the ritual of coaxing warmth outward began again, embers encouraged, steam rising from a pot, the room brightening by degrees. Dreams, too, had a place in winter's sleep. Stories told in the evenings, sagas of sea and storm, hints of gods and the old, large forces, seeded dreams that brought weather and wanderings into the mind's theatre. Elders took note of the dreams that repeated themselves. People kept private tallies of images that returned like familiar birds. No one could prove that dreams kept a house warmer, but it felt true that a mind occupied by a worthy tale shed less heat to useless fret. A good story is a kind of fur thrown over the spirit. In all of this, the absence of a fireplace was not the absence of heat. It was the presence of understanding. The central hearth gave less directional comfort than a mantle-framed blaze. But the longhouse's sleeping arrangements compensated through craft, the engineering of height and layer, the social geometry of shared warmth, the housekeeping rhythms that turned a simple plank and a pile of straw into a bed that met the body where it needed to be met. The night was long, but it was not empty. It held the hum of breath, the memory of hands that had shaken straw earlier, the promise that morning would inherit a house still intact, still warm enough, still itself. In the north, winter is an argument with the wind, long, patient, and won by inches. The Vikings did not silence the wind. They learned to make it pass by. Their houses did not stand as proud monuments but as practiced shapes settled into the landscape, low-shouldered and deliberate, designed to slip beneath the weather's attention. Insulation, in this world, was not a product bought and stapled, but a layered conversation among earth, wood, plant, snow, and careful hands. To step into a well-kept longhouse on a hard night was to feel a small miracle, the air still, the draught tamed. The walls speaking quietly of moss and fibre and the way a roof can become a garden of warmth even in the dark, sight came first. A house crouched where the wind broke itself, on the lee side of a slope, behind a stand of trees, along a ridge that taught the gusts to lift and spend themselves a little before they reached the door. The old people knew the wind's favourite paths. They read winter not by calendar but by where snow piled, where it scoured down to ice, and where the frost lay late into spring. A few yards of placement could mean a few degrees less cruelty. The house turned its narrow shoulders to the prevailing gusts. Its length ran with the landscape's grain, so the wind brushed past rather than pressed in. Building, too, followed winter's grammar. Thick walls of timber and wattle, of stone where stone was generous, of turf where soil was rich and bound with roots. The Vikings packed moss and wool into every seam that threatened to whisper. Clay daubs sealed wattle panels so the wind found only a smooth, patient face. Where boards met, they met with purpose, lapped or tongued, pegged tight and checked again when the first cold reminded the wood to shrink and shift. Gaps were not enemies. They were chores. A basket of moss by the door, a finger that knows the feel of a draft along a seam. These were winter tools as surely as the axe and the adze that shaped the beams. Above, the roof became the house's deep coat. A turf roof, in layers carefully set, held more than rain off. It held heat in. First came a base, planks or birch bark laid to shrug water. Then the sod itself, lifted with a spade so the grass and roots stayed married to their soil, and returned to the roof in interlocking patches like scales. The living roots bound one to another. The soil trapped air. The grass, quiet even under snow, remembered summer and did not surrender its structure. When winter laid its white hand upon the roof, it added another layer, for snow is a paradox, a cold thing that keeps warmth from leaking. The house hid under its winter pelt, and the pelt worked. Eaves were not forgotten. A roof's edge can be a flautist for the wind, teasing cold drafts into the house if left careless. So eaves were made to drip well away from the walls, their lines extended so meltwater fell where it would not sneak back under. Gutters, where they existed in seed form, were not the tidy troughs of later centuries but the thoughtful shaping of edges to keep water obedient. In freeze-thaw cycles, ice will pry at any weakness. Winter carpentry learned to round and bevel where straight edges would invite breaking. The door, that bright square of hospitality, is also winter's favorite test. A good door sat with weight and intelligence. It closed against a carved rebate, leather or felt strips cushioning the seam. Hinges set into stout posts bore the door's weight without sag so that no telltale crescent of daylight opened for the cold to slip through. In harsher places, a porch or small entry, more a pocket of air than a room, stood before the true door, a buffer where wind could circle and fall tired before it found the inner latch. Inside, a thick curtain could be drawn across the doorway on the coldest nights, another soft wall where none could be built. Windows, when they appeared, were modest, small eyes set where light mattered most. Winter does not reward grand pains. The Norse answer was restraint, openings covered with oiled skins, translucent enough to wash the room in a gentle grey. Sometimes thin horn panes. Sometimes wooden shutters closed snug at night and in weather. The equal of glass lay in habit, the shutter drawn at dusk, the seam checked with a hand, the little draught stopped with a twist of wool. Light was a precious wedge. So was stillness inside the walls. The house continued its defence. Chinks were stuffed with moss, with woolen scraps, with anything that would trap air without drinking damp. Where walls were lined, boards were set a finger's breadth off the outer layer to create a thin, unmoving air space, an invisible blanket. Floors, too, planks raised over sleepers or simply layered rushes renewed when they flattened. A floor is a heat thief when it is forgotten. It is a friend when it remembers to be dry and softly uneven, full of little pockets where air can rest. In some houses, an earthen floor was tamp hard and sprinkled with straw. In others, wooden decking lifted footsteps above the cold that pools low, making every stride a degree kinder. Smoke, the house's winter tenant, played its role in insulation. The beams blackened by years of hearth breath were not only a record of meals and stories. They were treated wood, less likely to absorb damp. Soot sealed pores. Tar and fat rubbed into certain timbers turned aside wet and wind alike. A roof vent was not only an exit but a negotiator, opened or narrowed with shutters and simple baffles to keep the smoke's path steady without lending a path to the chill. To manage smoke is to manage drafts. If smoke behaves, so does the air that joins it in its slow ascent. The longhouse learned to move air without surrendering heat. Low vents near the eaves could be opened briefly to release the heaviness of a too warm, too damp room, then closed before the cold learned about the opportunity. A pot simmering on coals added moisture. A bundle of damp wool by the hearth could be dried, but not all at once, not so that the wall sweated. Balance was a winter word. A house too tight can grow chilly with damp, for wet air stings more sharply. A house too open becomes a bellows for the wind's lungs. The skilled householder found the middle and kept it outside. Windbreaks multiplied the house's intelligence. Fences stacked with brush, low stone walls, the careful keeping of outbuildings at particular angles. These taught the wind to turn and to thin. A woodpile, if it was high and solid, served as a wall that paid you twice. Once in the way, it bluntly interrupted a gust. Once again when a log was chosen and set to work in the hearth. Even livestock pens, set where they steadied the air around the main building, joined the choreography. The farmstead became a small landscape of layered protections, each modest, together persuasive. Snow management belonged to insulation as surely as turf and timber. When storms laid their weight across roofs, the ear knew how to listen for strain, the groan that is ordinary and old, the sharper song that warns. Snow left where it lay on a sound turf roof warmed the house. Snow that threatened collapse had to be gentled away, lifted in sections so the roof skin did not tear. Paths were carved not only for feet but for air, trenches that led the wind along rather than into the door. Drifts were coaxed to form where they did no harm, like placing heavy furniture in a room so that movement flows. Maintenance was winter's daily liturgy. A seam found breathing was fed moss. A peg that worked loose was tap home. A shutter that decided to chatter in a gale was quieted with a wedge of wood. The hands that mended clothing also mended houses. The wisdom that placed a patch on a knee placed a new chip of wood where a hinge asked. Tools waited near the places they were used, and all by the door, a mallet hanging from a peg at the window side, a small bag of oakum and cord where the roof ladder began. Repair done before bed saved warmth in the night. Repair done at dawn saved the day from starting with cold. The house carried memory. In summer, the turf roof grew herbs as if rehearsing winter remedies. In autumn, cracks were sought and filled when the clay was still willing. Birch bark was added where water thought it might wander. New moss was gathered from the wood-shaded places and set to dry, stored like a green-brown treasure for the lean months when drafts arrive without invitation. Children learned to find good moss, the kind springy with tiny air chambers, and to tell it from the kind that goes slick with wet and refuses to help. They learned, too, to feel a wall with the back of the hand, for the back listens better than the palm. It can hear a draft that the front will miss, sound changed in a well-insulated house. The wind outside sang a muffled song. Inside, voices softened to match the air's gentleness. A house tightly kept invites quiet. The ear heard different hierarchies. The occasional stamp from the buyer, the tiny clicks of contracting wood as the fire eased after the evening meal, the skip of a pot lid when a bubble insisted. The mind learned these signatures and took comfort from them. Even silence has textures, and insulation is one of them. The absence of a neat, stone fireplace with its tall chimney did not mean the absence of strategy. The Vikings' central hearth, their turf roofs and moss-sealed seams, their layered walls and wind-calmed doorways, these were the technologies of their latitude and time. Each choice saved a little heat, and a little heat saved becomes a steady life. Comfort, in this world, was not a single invention but 1,000 attentions. A curtain hung heavy at the door. A shutter that fits like a well-made mitten. A roof that becomes a hillside and lets winter walk over it without noticing the warm breath beneath. Winter in the north is a careful accountant. It tallies every spark, every splinter, every breath of warmth the household can keep. Without fireplaces in the later, chimneyed sense, Viking homes relied on something quieter and more intimate, the culture of coals. The central hearth, low, open, and honest, was less a spectacle and more a steadiness. It demanded attention the way a living thing does. To survive, families learned to stretch fire like cloth, to weave hours out of embers, to make a single log do 3 different jobs before it finally fell to ash. In this discipline, there was security. In its rituals, there was peace. The day began with a question answered by the poker. Did the night's banked coals live? If the ash stirred and exhaled a faint orange, a small thrill passed through the room. Success, continuity, warmth saved. If not, the next motions were practiced and unhurried. Scrape together the memory of heat. Shave curls from dry wood. Lay a lattice of kindling that invited flame the way cupped hands invite water. Fire-starting materials were not an afterthought. Bundles of birch bark, winter's loyal friend, were kept dry as a promise. Resinous splinters from pine knots lay near the hearth for moments just like this. A pouch held tinder from charred cloth or fungus, coaxed to catch from a spark and glow with the patience of a sleeping coal. Fuel was chosen as carefully as words in a delicate story. Dense hardwoods were prizes where they grew. Softwoods, more common in the far north, were made to act wisely by how they were cut and used. Logs seasoned in summer gave up their water content to sun and wind and entered winter dry, light for their size, ready to burn clean and long. Splitting a log was not merely to make it smaller. It opened the wood's heart so flame could find its way. Thick pieces became the house's slow drums, beating steady heat. Thin pieces were the quick violins, agile and encouraging when a pot asked for a livelier boil or when damp cloaks needed urging from cool to warm. Even twigs had their role, bridging the space between tinder and kindling, playing the fine notes that persuade flame to climb. The hearth, a shallow basin of cleared earth or stone, held a map of heat that the hand soon learned to read. There was the bright side, lively, sometimes impetuous, good for quick tasks, and the sober side, coal-rich, even, better for long simmering. A flat stone at the edge might serve as a griddle. Another, pushed a hand's breadth into coals, made a predictable oven for roots and flatbread. A small trench under the fire's bed, lined with stones and fed now and then with the light paths of air from a bellows, allowed the coals to breathe without roaring. Bellows themselves, leather lungs hinged and handled, were used sparingly. A fire pulled too hard is a fire that eats faster. Winter demanded the opposite, restraint that still provided enough. Banking the fire at night was part craft, part lullaby. Ash is an insulator in the older sense, sleeping powder that holds heat close. As the last meal gave way to cleanup, someone scooped ash around the life center, mounding it like a small, protective dune. A few slow-burning chunks of wood were tucked in, one at a time, so their edges touched the living glow but not too greedily. The idea was not to feed the fire but to feed the morning, keep a heart alive under ash so that dawn would inherit a task half completed. The tools for this were simple and beloved: an iron hook, a wooden rake blackened from use, a scoop carved years ago and fitted to the hand that loved it. Fuel scarcity wrote its own paragraphs in the winter story. Wood piles were memories from summer labor, stacked with care so that snow shed off and wind could thread through, drying rather than wetting. A good stack was a wall with grammar, cross-hatched ends to bind the center, bark side up to shrug weather, a slight lean toward a supporting fence or post so a gale could not tip it. Near the door, a small reserve stood under a lean-to, fetchable in bad weather, meant for emergencies and mornings when the door refused to open all the way because snow had grown like a patient animal against it. Dried dung, where animals were plenty and woodland thin, took its honorable place in the fuel economy. Not glorious, but reliable. Not clean-flamed, but steady. The dance between fire and food was conducted at the scale of minutes and coals. A pot hung high when you wanted the coals to last, lowered when you accepted the expense of heat for the comfort of a quicker meal. The iron hook on which the pot hung often had notches or a simple sliding catch, the settings learned by feel, third notch for barley porridge. A notch higher when milk threatened to scald. Lowest for the quick blanch that keeps cabbage tender in brine. Soapstone vessels, where the land offered stone and the household the skill, kept faith with heat even off the fire. A stew thickened on the coals could be set aside, wrapped, and it would continue its work in the slow alchemy of retained warmth. Light, like heat, was rationed without meanness. Tallow lamps and rushlights drew from stores of fat that also fed bellies, so their flames were asked to be small and steady. Wicks were trimmed with the same deliberation given to coals. Soot was wiped before it thickened and began to rob light the way a draught robs warmth. A lamp set behind a polished bit of horn or bright metal cast its field a little further. One more trick to ask more from less. Lamps were carried with a hand cupped, more for habit than fear, and set down with a tiny ceremony that felt like thanking them. Even a bright moon served as fuel in a philosophical sense. Its light gave rest to lamps, and rest to lamps gave rest to stores. Children learned their share of firecraft in tasks that matched their reach. They gathered thin sticks after windstorms, They learned which bark would catch quick and which sulked. They watched elders bank the coals and were allowed, at last, to try once or twice under a generous eye. A splinter of resin-rich wood became a lesson in the difference between flame and heat. A failed morning rekindling became a story told kindly over porridge. What went wrong, how to do better, how not to waste breath trying to persuade wet wood to do what it refuses. These small apprenticeships turned anxiety into competence, which is a warmer blanket than worry. There were luxuries, and winter knew their names. A log with a pleasant scent. A fistful of juniper added to the coals for a moment before guests arrived. A rare piece of driftwood from a summer shore, saved for a midwinter night so the room would fill with the smell of Fireplaces. These were not extravagances to be repeated. They were punctuation marks in a season that otherwise preferred long, even sentences. Hospitality bent the rules gently. Another light lit. Another log chosen, because warmth shared is still warmth saved. If not in the woodpile, then in the trust that returns when the door opens on another day and another favor is needed. Ash. The end of fire had duties in its afterlife. Sifted fine, it polished metal. It joined fat and water to make Lylene soap when the year allowed. It scattered on paths to bite at ice where boots would otherwise slide and spend knees and tempers. Some ash, sprinkled thinly in the latrine pit or in middens, tamped down smell and invited a cleaner spring. A hearth that gave heat to the present also prepared the future, in the way that good systems do. Nothing in winter is allowed to live only once. Everything has a second task waiting. Even the smoke, an untidy companion, was taught manners. Vents and roof seams became instruments, opened and damped in small adjustments until the hearth's exhale went upward without stealing the room's hard-won warmth. On heavy weather days when smoke sulked and sank, a string of small, low adjustments kept discomfort from turning into danger. A door propped a finger's width for 2 minutes. A roof baffle wedged with a sliver of wood. A pot lid set ajar so steam did not thicken the room to the point that the walls wept. Housekeeping here was a kind of weatherwork, and those who were good at it had the same calm as those who know how to read a sky. All of this, the shaving of kindling, the nursing of embers, the preference for coals over flame, the neatness with lamps, was a language of respect for limits. A fireplace, in later centuries, turned heat into display. The Viking hearth turned fire into companionship. It sat low and breathed level with the people who tended it, and its voice was modest. In that modesty, there was reliability. The winter did not need to be conquered. It needed to be lived with, and the hearth's steady pulse taught the house to keep time with the season rather than spend itself trying to play louder than the wind. When night came, and the last spoon was placed aside, the final rearrangement began. Coals coaxed into a red bed. Ash drifted over like a grey snowfall. Tools laid where the hand would find them in the dim early hour. Someone watched the last bright tips go dull, satisfied but not sentimental, and drew the door curtain. Outside, winter continued its arithmetic. Inside, the household had balanced the ledger for another day. The house slept, the coals slept within it, and between them a promise glowed. That morning would open its hand and find a small, willing light waiting to become a flame once more. Winter survival was not a single heroic act but 1,000 small obediences to the season's demands. The Viking household moved through these obediences like a clock, steady, repeating, full of parts that needed tending. No fireplace with a tall chimney presided, promising theatrical heat and leisure. Instead, the humble hearth and the people around it kept a kind of industry running, an industry of care. Each task, modest in itself, interlocked with the rest so that the day did not fray. In the deep months of cold, there was comfort in routine, the assurance that one thing done well made the next thing easier, and that a string of such things, tied end to end, could pull a family through the longest night. Morning began with embers and breath. One person, often by habit rather than decree, rose first and checked the banked coals. A whisper of orange under ash meant the day would begin with persuasion rather than invention. While kindling picked up the lesson of flame, water was set to warm, snow gathered the evening before, or ice chipped at dusk, now melting toward usefulness. Warm water greets winter better than cold. A face washed, a throat eased. Hands warmed before work is work made friendlier. Bowls were placed near the hearth's even side. A thin gruel made thicker with barley saved from a night's last measure. And a small knob of fat invited to dissolve into the morning as quietly as light. Livestock expected attention without drama. The door curtain lifted. A tongue of cold air slipped in and curled along the floor. Boots, beat clean of last night's frost, stepped into the byre or the attached stall where beasts slept and steamed. Bedding was turned so that wet layers sank and dry layers rose, a small geology that kept smell honest and hooves warm. Water buckets were broken of their rim of ice and refilled from the warmed pot. Feed measured out not by luxury but by arithmetic. How much weight a body must carry to spring, how much hay a bale still holds. Animals met these rituals with the calm gratitude of breath and munching. Their comfort returned as milk, as strength for pulling, as the quiet background heat of living bodies inside. The house tidied itself into readiness. Sleeping platforms were shaken free of straw's small chaff. Blankets folded where they wouldn't drink the day's steam. The floor, earthen or plank, was swept with a broom that knew every hollow and edge. It is a truth the North learns early. Dirt steals warmth because it invites damp. Cleanliness is not vanity. It is insulation's silent partner. Near the door, pegs took on their winter conversations. Here the cloaks drip, there the mittens rest. Here the boots sleep upside down so their insides stay as dry as a kept promise. A place for each thing meant less heat spent hunting for it. In winter, order itself is a fuel. Then came the tools, each with its own weather. The axe's edge inspected by thumb and light. A whetstone fed a little water. A few strokes to restore conversation between blade and wood. Ropes coiled and checked against the sly stiffness cold gives to fibers. Sleds leaned where they would be easy to shoulder and pull. Indoors tools, too. The distaff and the spindle for spinning wool. The looms warp weighted and taut. Needles nested in their cloth roll. A small box of buttons, hooks, brooches, strap ends, and the 100 metal conversations that keep garments loyal. Winter frees certain hours from the tyranny of the field. Those hours are woven into future warmth, food tasks threaded through the day like a refrain. A pot, once the morning had graduated to noon grey, was given something to become. Dried fish softened, then stewed with barley. Bones that had already given their first good simmer now asked to try once more, yielding a broth that carried salt and memory. Bread came in its winter shapes, thin rounds laid on a hot stone, dense loaves cut sparingly, a flat cake pricked with a point so it would not puff and waste heat. Butter, when it was, rose like a good mood in a small dish set near but not too near the hearth. Sour milk and SKY-like curds offered brightness sharper than the window's light. A crock of fermented cabbage, opened carefully, contributed crunch that tasted like the memory of a garden told in another language. Repair was not a chore. It was a creed. A cracked bucket staves its ruin if a spline of wood is driven and the hoop is reset. A split in a spoon's handle surrenders if warmed, glued, and wrapped to forget it ever gaped. Mittens thin at the heel of the hand, where a tool's haft rubs. That place is strengthened with a small oval of felt sewn in with close, smug stitches. Children were often given these repairs because their small hands can make neat work, and because ownership is born from maintenance. When a child mends a thing, the thing begins to belong to the future, not just the present. Such apprenticeship is winter's true curriculum. The weather itself was both adversary and calendar. A day of high, pale light after snow invited the airing of bedding. Blankets hung outside to let frost kill what summer once hatched. Straw ticks, if light enough and time generous, were stitched anew with fresh fill, a task done swiftly to avoid welcoming damp. On days the sky sat low and the wind argued, indoor tasks swelled to fill the hours, wool carded so its fibers parted and aligned. Thread spun in a rhythm that matched the breath. Beams inspected for the slow truth smoke tells. Soot that glistens means damp, soot that powders means dry. A careful hand with a small brush pushed soot where it best served, sealing little pores, making winter's work easier on the wood. Paths asked to be kept honest. The short run from door to byre. The longer pull from woodpile to threshold. The narrow trench from well or stream to the house. All needed shaping so boots held confidence and sled runners glided. Ash spread on ice made a grit that spoke in friction. Straw laid thinly caught the foot when the day had turned treacherous. A path is not a luxury. It is a line that tells the wind when not to lie, a message to snow that it must choose another resting place. When neighbours came, as neighbours must in a human winter, those lines told their feet where welcome begins. Social chores wore their warmth like cloaks. A house with a good fire day invited a widow from up the hill to sit and work where the light was kind. A man with an extra morning, unexpected because a chore proved shorter than feared, used it to mend a fence that helped both households or to drop a parcel of dried fish where he knew a bin ran lean. The economy of favours holds its value best when the weather is worst. In the longhouse, a bench never quite forgot the groove of the last guest, and a spare bowl at the shelf's back could be swept down in a single reach of the hand. Hospitality was not holiday. It was winter policy illness. When it came, rearranged the machinery gently but decisively. A cough earned steam. Pot set to whisper under a little tent where the breath could drink warmth and moisture. Herbs saved from mild months, angelica for strength, yarrow for comfort, juniper to clear, were measured with the seriousness small doses deserve. Tasks reflowed around the week like water. A child who usually hauled would measured grains. An elder with steady hands trimmed lampwicks and watched the hearth in a chair that respected their knees. In this way, the house showed its elasticity. Work knew how to move along different routes and still arrive. The day's second meal came and went. Light did its narrow northern arc and stepped aside for dusk. Evening chores were as ceremonial as dawn's. Animals bedded, coals banked, snow brushed from cloaks before they came inside, boots set where morning would thank the foresight. Somewhere in that hour, the house took inventory in a language half spoken, half understood by the way hands lingered and eyes measured. How much grain remains, and what does that mean in weeks? Did the door latch take the last storm well? Was the roof snow's weight a friend or a foreshadowing of a task tomorrow? The day's ledger balanced itself with the small arithmetic of observation, and sleep, when it came, was more confident for it. If this seems unromantic, it is because winter refuses romance without payment. But in the payment there is a strange sweetness. A broom that fits the hand. A jug warmed just enough that milk meets lips kindly. A floor swept so the tiny splinters that would steal socks are banished. These are proofs that people and place are in conversation. The absence of a grand fireplace never meant the absence of warmth. It meant warmth was distributed, in routines, in tools kept ready, in chores done with ritual grace. The house did not blaze. It breathed. That breath was the sum of 100 modest exhalations, of animals, of simmering pots, of lamps trimmed, of people who knew their work and did it without hurry. By the time night gathered itself outside the oilskin window, the machinery had been wound again. A last sweep near the hearth. A last check of the door's felted edge. A last look into the byre to catch a hint that a ewe might lamb earlier than imagined. Then the curtain set, the room dimmed to embers, the longhouse given back to its slow, shared sleep. Tomorrow, the clock would start again with the poker and the breath. The same chores would call the same names. The same satisfaction would meet the last task and make a soft place for the body to rest. In that repetition, the Vikings made their case to winter and, quietly, won it. In the long season, when daylight travels like a shy animal along the horizon and then slips away, light itself becomes a household member with needs and moods. Without a high, stone fireplace to throw theatrical radiance into a room. Viking families lived by humbler constellations. The banked hearth's red hush, the patient eye of a tallow lamp, the brief, useful brightness of a rushlight. Light was rationed with tenderness, coaxed rather than commanded. Not a flood, but a thread drawn through the hours so that hands could work, eyes could read the faces they loved, and the mind could feel it wasn't alone in the dark. The lamp was a small boat on a dark sea, a simple bowl, stone-hollowed and smoothed by years of fingers, clay-fired until it remembered its shape, or hammered metal with a lip that understood how oil travels, held the fuel that winter asked the household to spare. Tallow, rendered from slaughter-time fat, burned with a memory of the animals that warmed the byre. Where geography and stores allowed, Fish oil joined the work, slipperier, a little brighter, but never squandered. Wicks were not afterthoughts. They were twisted from tow or linen remnants, from wattees just so, from plant fibres saved with the same seriousness given to grain. A wick too Fat drank greedily and smoked. Too thin and it sulked, giving flame meaner than its cost. The hand that trimmed a wick held a kind of authority in the room. Rushlights were winter's pencils, quick lines drawn and used. A rush, stripped to its pale pith and soaked in fat, burned at a pace everyone learned without clock or tally. You knew what could be done in a rushlight's life. 3 seams, perhaps, or a page of saga remembered aloud and corrected by the elder whose voice knew where the waves rose in the story. A rushlight invited focus because it didn't promise to stay. Children came to understand task length in this gentle arithmetic. The mind shaped itself to portions of flame. Windows were not holes for the weather to sneer through. They were disciplined mouths that drank a measured daylight. Glass was rare and precious. More often, light came through oiled skins, sheep or seal or other, stretched and cured until they glowed like winter milk. The world beyond blurred into tones and gestures, a stride against snow, the suggestion of a tree shoulder with snow stacked along its windward side. Horn panes, when they could be had, gave a brighter, more obedient glow but required the same courtesy at night. Shutters drawn with care, seams finger-checked. A felted strip pressed into a stubborn corner that insisted on breathing the wrong way. Daylight was welcomed as if it were a guest who must not be tired out. When it left, the shutters closed like eyelids, reflectors multiplied small gifts. A lamp set near a shallow dish of polished horn, a hammered plate, or even a bowl whitened with ash could throw its modest circle further. Catching threads on the loom or the fine edge of a knife blade asked to return to perfect. Snow outside did its own reflecting, a slow, blue-white brightness that came up from the ground as if the world had lit from below. On clear days, a board leaned to catch the low sun and persuade it through a skin window like a second thought. Even the hearth's glow answered to arrangement. Coals spread a finger wider so a pot and a pair of hands working. Beside, it could see each other without stealing from the woodpile. Light had a vocabulary of sounds as much as sights. The faint spit of a lamp when a wick wanted trimming. The whisper a rushlight makes when it has almost reached its pinched end. The soft scrape of a shutter's wooden peg when dusk asks for privacy. The house learned these timbres and made its adjustments without speech. A lamp was moved a hand's breadth closer to the spindle so the thread would not stray. A child lifted the rushlight stand and set it by the repair bench, and a buckle that would have been reattached crookedly in the half-dark found its proper holes again. There was a calendar in lamps, too. Rendering day, when tallow was made and poured and saved, smelled like resolve. An autumn of plenty wrote itself into little crocks. A lean year wrote itself into the lamp's smaller appetite, and the household's sharper genius for placing light where it did the most good. Fuel was counted not by the miser's cold breath but by the steward's warm one. This much for work, this much for safety, this much for story. Story mattered because winter is a listener. It leans against the walls and waits to hear whether the people within are merely surviving or also keeping themselves company. Timekeeping, in such months, was a choreography of shadows and tasks. Dawn was not a bell. It was the color of smoke thinning at the roof seam. Midday came when fingers asked for a rest from the cold even inside, and the lamp's base felt warm under the palm. Evening was a circle drawn inward, a radius of flame measured by what the household still hoped to accomplish, a loomsday length, a child's learning of a new knot, an elder's portion of the tale. Nights were not always single and monolithic. Between first sleep and second, when a few lamps made planets over the sleeping benches, someone wrote the day's ledger in the head. Wood in, wool spun, hide scraped, embers saved, tempers kept. Small mercies added to the store. Outdoor light work was winter's rare sport. When the sky pulled itself open into a pearl-grey arc or, on certain miraculous days, the cold crystallized into brightness instead of threat, chores ran outside to benefit. Bedding went to the line. A pelt took the frost that kills what summer laid into its fur. A barrel was rotated to even its freezing. A path was recut so that, with sun low, its edges would catch the light and guide evening feet. Children learned to throw snow where it would become a lamp for the yard, a wall that reflected dusk back toward the door, a small windbreak that became a dull mirror for the moon. For all that, darkness was not an enemy but a boundary. The Vikings inhabited it without pretending to conquer it. They respected the way darkness slows the breath, muffles the room, and suggests a pace. A bright blaze was a rare feast. Regular nights offered something else: the hearth's long patience, a lamp that listened while a hand mended, and the company of others speaking softly so words could carry without the light needing to. The absence of a grand fireplace taught a different kind of seeing: how to let the eyes grow patient, how to place work within the radius of a small flame, how to trust that not every corner requires witness to be useful, light joined faith and season in quiet rituals. A lamp lit for someone ill was kept at a particular place on the bench. A wick trimmed and placed beside it meant hope held in readiness. On the year's darkest nights, someone might bring a fir twig in and set it near the hearth, a sign not of ornament but of continuity, the green that says time has more pages than the one you're on. The aurora, when it walked the roof with its cold banners, was watched from the doorway with hats on and mouths closed. No lamp competed. The house let the sky do its slow, unowned work, and then the curtain fell, and the little hearth star resumed its dependable astronomy. If a lamp failed, spilled or smoked itself into disobedience, the room did not panic. Hands knew where to find the spare wick, the bone pin that lifts a thread from fat without wetting the fingers, the rag that answers everything with readiness. The discipline here was not severity. It was kindness to the future. A lamp tended now would not betray you in the hour when someone must fetch water in a hurry or when a baby found the cold a reason to cry. All our tools are timepieces if we mind them. A lamp, most of all, keeps the hours by how much of itself it has left to give to. So the Vikings endured a winter that never promised ease by understanding that brightness is made of arrangements, not displays. The hearth was a steady red hush. Lamps were soft, portable suns. Windows were tamed mouths that sipped day and closed when night brought its usefulness. In this economy, light was never loud but always sufficient, and sufficiency, repeated over many nights, is its own kind of abundance. When spring finally loosened its first gold thread across the floorboards, the lamps did not retire in shame. They rested like tools that had done honorable work and would, before long, be asked again. Winter does not close the world, it redraws it. For Vikings and their northern neighbors, the cold months laid down new roads, white, silent, persuasive. Marsh became meadow, rutted tracks became level corridors, rivers, asleep under armor, offered lines as straight as thought. Without the fireplace's theatrical promise, households learned another promise: that movement, done wisely, generates its own small warmth, and that errands and visits and trade could continue when the land's green map had been folded away and replaced with something pale and spare. A path began at the door, first of all. The narrow trench pressed each morning so boots found confidence. Beyond the yard, a road shape was the sum of decisions made in other seasons, where barns stood, where neighbors lived, where the river bent like an elbow. Winter simplified those choices. The river, especially, offered a logic no summer cart could match. Once the ice grew thick and began to sing its deep, iron song, people listened at the banks and learned its mood. The careful knew to test thickness. Near bends and in places where springs moved under the skin, they learned the language of cracks, some ordinary as breath, some prophetic enough to ask for another way. Sleds, simple and obedient, were the winter's carts. A good sled married wood and rope in a geometry that pleased both snow and the body that pulled. Runners were shod in the knowledge of friction, the grain of wood set in the right direction, the bottoms rubbed with tallow or with the smoothness that comes of use, the curve at the front's tip generous enough to climb drifts rather than stab them. A short sled, loaded well, followed like a polite dog. A long sled, meant for timber or for the big jobs that winter makes possible, asked for a team and promised a harvest of wood in return. Children learned to lash load so nothing shifted, so weight rode low, so the rope did not cut the hand. A good lashing carries a day. A poor one adds 2 more trips. Feet, too, became winter's tools. Bone skates, ribs or leg bones smooth and pierced, turned a frozen creek into a swift lane. They did not cut and glide like steel, they skimmed. The push coming from poles that bit the ice and sent the body forward in quieting strides. The sound they made was a small, silvery whisper, the sort that makes talk unnecessary. Elsewhere, where hills and customs agreed, wooden skis with animal skin grip undersides carried hunters and messengers across deep snow, one long foot ahead. Of the other, poles a metronome that set a steady, enduring time. The skill was patience more than speed, learning to read the snow's grain, to favour hollows when wind made the ridges cruelly bare, to pause where the eye could count a safe sequence before the body committed. Clothing for travel did not change in kind, only in arrangement. Layers loosened for the pull uphill, cinched again on the crest so sweat did not steal heat once the body's work eased. A hood pulled up became a private room against the wind. A scarf across the mouth kept breath from lashing the throat with cold. Hands were left in mittens when possible, fingers sharing heat. When work demanded the thumb's liberty, a pair of thinner undergloves waited beneath, so skin never touched iron or rope naked. Travel is housekeeping away from home. You carry the rules with you and arrange your person the way the longhouse is arranged, with thought given to drafts and damp and how warmth moves. Navigation was humbler in winter light but not blind. Familiar tree lines told the truth when sky and ground became the same white thought. Fences, even short ones, stitched the land into readable panels. Stones remembered by heart. Hear the one that looks like a sleeping seal. They're the one with a rust-red vein, tied one bit of knowledge to the next. On nights when stars bared themselves, the sky offered slow counsel, the north's fixed pupil, the scatter of the familiar hunters and sheepfolds that stories had taught children to name long before winter asked them to guide afoot. And always, the wind, that old orator, gave hints about drift patterns, about which side of a hill would spare the legs, about the direction of whether still an hour away. Errands, in this season, were threaded beads rather than single jewels. A trip to a neighbour folded in a visit to the wood stand where a fallen pine waited, well seasoned, just inside the shelter of trees. The return from a fishing hole, lines, dropped through augured ice and watched with the stillness winter teaches, carried not only the catch but also a loop through the low place where the sled could run downhill with a soft rasp and save a shoulder. Along these lines, news travelled too, a birth told in the way a runner halted at a door, a death announced by a sled without laughter, a good story parcelled out so that warmth went where it would be most appreciated that night. There are dangers winter does not apologise for. Thin ice tells its lies in a gloss that looks inviting. Crust snow pretends to hold a foot and then argues otherwise, jarring the knee, spending breath that should be saved. The wise traveller carries small contraries to such tricks, a staff that probes the ice a step ahead, a loop of rope ready to throw, a little sealskin bag of dried meat and curd and a twist of grain so that hunger's sharpness does not turn good judgment brittle. Fire, when carried, is carried as potential. Tinder kept absolutely dry, a sparking tool wrapped and double wrapped. Most days, though, the better fire is the one banked at home, and travel is shaped to return to it before darkness folds entirely. Trading in winter took on a different courtesy. A bundle of wool skeins pulled easily on a sled. A carved spindle whorl or a repaired axe head could be wrapped in cloth and carried in an inner pocket where body heat protected the iron's temper. Fish dried to a lightness that made distance reasonable. A pelt, cured and sewn into a tidy cylinder, rode whether like a small, well-behaved animal. The door that opened to receive such things received the traveller as well. A lamp moved to hands. Breadth outward to widen the circle of light. A bowl ladled wider. The warmth of its contents the first payment for whatever kindness the day had required to bring the person to the threshold. Children learned winter roads first as play, the eternal geography from door to drift, from drift to the small slide that lives beside any decent slope. But play grows serious at a kind, natural pace. They are sent to the next house with a message. Stitched into memory, they carry home a crock that must not be dropped and a lesson about ice that must not be ignored. They return with a mouth red from cold and bright with pride. Their paths became the first drafts of the grown routes they would one day trace in longer arcs, and the land became intimate not by map but by footsteps. Travel at night, when it could not be avoided, was a different arithmetic. Lamps are not for the wind. They become liabilities in a gust. The eye is better, after a while, on its own. Snow throws back enough of the sky's dimness that a path can be guessed and then confirmed by the shoulder's memory of where the hill usually rises. Sound helps. The river's ice sings in certain keys. The forest speaks differently under frost. A traveler learns the difference between a branch settling and a creature moving, between the dry hiss of blown flakes and the tiny chimes of ice crystals falling when a drift's edge decides to soften. This kind of listening peculiar to winter is as safe as any lamp, and cheaper. And yet, for all the planning and tools, the best winter road is always the one that leads back to the longhouse while strength is still generous. The door's curtain lifts. The room's breath meets the traveller's and smooths it. Mittens go to their peg. The sled's rope is coiled and hung. The story of the trip, thin ice near the bend, a fox crossing like a thought, the way the clouds opened an inch and gave a pale sun that felt like a hand on the shoulder, is told and added to the house's store of winter knowledge. Movement, in this season, is a way of keeping the map alive, but the map's purpose is always to return you to the bench where soup waits and coals answer a nudge. So winter drew the lines and the Vikings walked them. Bones skimmed on ice, runners whispered over snow, poles tapped time, breath rose and then disappeared into the large, listening air. The land, temporarily remade, offered its spare beauties. A fence top glazed and shining, a reed frozen into a delicate question mark, the wide, soft roll of the river under moon. The people accepted what was offered and travelled without haste, keeping faith with the season's rules and with the hearth that would gather them again at day's end. Cold weather makes a fortress of the body, but it asks the mind to furnish the rooms. In the Viking North, where winter nights could feel as long as a thought that refuses to end, survival meant more than straw and wool, more than sealed seams and careful coals. It also meant a steadying of spirit, the cultivation of moods and meanings that kept people companionable with the dark, without a fireplace's grand theatrics to mesmerize the eye. The longhouse relied on other theatres, the mouth that sings, the hands that play, the memory that carries a story like an ember and blows it alive again when needed. In such months, culture was not an ornament. It was a blanket shared across benches. There was the scald, or at least someone who knew how to be one when the moment called. Not every farm had a poet by trade, but every farm had a poet by necessity, a person who remembered the old words, who could braid a tale until it shone like hoarfrost, who could cleave a mood cleanly with a joke and then mend it with a proverb. The sagas did not live only on carved stave churches or in the halls of chieftains. They moved in humbler circuits, crossing kitchens, hovering above the steam of barley, settling beside a bed platform where a child's eyes chased sleep and caught a hero instead. A story is a lamp you can pass from hand to hand without losing any light. In winter, every hand wanted one. Music fit the rooms like breath. A small frame drum could give winter a heartbeat. A mouth harp could catch silver out of the air and make it ring. A bow teased a tagalapa into that tender, horsehair sound that feels like wind turned friendly. These instruments did not compete with the season. They conversed with it. A bowed melody could be tucked into the house's weave without startling anyone from their work. A rhythm under a song made churns and carders and whittlers keep time together, and togetherness is one of the mind's oldest warmers. Children beat simple patterns on a table or on the ribs of a tucked-away barrel. Elders tapped the heel of a hand where bones still liked to dance a little. Games cleared a space for cheer to sit down. Nefertafel, the table game of king and attackers, spread on boards worn smooth by decades of concentrated thought. It trained a winter kind of cunning, not the wild risk of summer adventure, but the small, domestic boldness of watching, waiting, then moving a piece that makes the rest rearrange themselves. Counting games, knucklebones, riddles, and the gentle, needling contests of which sharpen the house without making it brittle. The winner had bragging rights sized perfectly for rooms this small, just enough to raise laughter, not enough to give offense. A winter household knows the difference between a boast that warms and a boast that pulls a draft through the door, work sang, too. Weaving has a tempo. So does spinning. A loom makes its wooden syllables, tap, change, pull, beat, and a song sets itself to those pulses until the day acquires a backbone of rhythm that holds everything upright without visible effort. Lullabies folded the names of animals and seasons into a soft kind of geography that taught a child where they lived, in a place where snow is a teacher, where wind is a storyteller, where the sun is a shy but faithful friend who goes away only to find a better way back. Men sang work songs as well, when sled runner stuck, when logs needed a count to lift together, when the ice was stubborn and the auger's handle asked for steady patience. Faith threaded winter like a narrow gold line woven through a dark cloth. Offerings were not pageants so much as acknowledgments, a sip set aside before anyone drank, a morsel lifted toward the roof's seam where smoke leaves and luck enters, a word spoken in a corner of the room that had been kind before and might be kind again. Midwinter brought its deeper customs, Jewel, a season of renewal in a time that often felt like ending. A branch of evergreen set near the hearth said summer still had a pulse somewhere under the snow. A small exchange of gifts, modest but meant, restated the treaty of the household. I see you, I count you among my warmth. Rituals were careful with animals and careful with hope. The point was not spectacle but continuity, a way for a community to hold hands across the storm, runes and marks, quiet literacy for winter's ledger, lived on sticks and bone. A runestave kept in a pocket could be turned like a worry stone until it spoke a remembered proverb or a charm fit for the task at hand. Safe travel. Safe birth. Safe return of a fisher who walked out too far in a fog of his own thoughts. Practical notes were scratched where they needed to be, on a beam that had been mended, on a tool that must not wander from its peg. The house itself became a library, its surfaces holding information the way a field holds moisture. In spring, those notes would bleed into memory and the wood would go on being wood, quietly smarter for the winter lines that had once lived upon it. Hospitality took on the dimensions of theatre without a stage. A visitor entered and the house drew itself wider, a lamp set closer to the centre, a place made on the bench, a bowl found and warmed by dipping in hot water so it would not cool the soup too quickly. Stories elongated to make room for a new listener. Songs were chosen for choruses even a stranger could learn on the second round. In winter, a host becomes a conductor of warmth, deciding what small luxuries to spend to raise the room's temperature, one more log than strict accounting would prefer. A scrap of dried apple saved for evenings when morale needed a citrus that winter could not otherwise provide. That spending was not waste. It was investment. In a season that punishes solitude, community is the thickest wool you can weave. Grief did not pause for ice. The house knew how to lower its flame but keep it steady. Words came more slowly. Songs changed key. The game board went back on its peg and the drums slept under a folded cloth. People worked nearer to one another than usual. The longhouse's breath grew a little softer at the edges so that sudden noises would not pour at the sore places. The elders told a story about someone who had also lived through a winter like this and who had, by spring, found a way to carry on. Such stories are not instructions so much as lanterns left along a path. When laughter returned, it did so carefully, the way a bird lands on a branch after it has been heavy with snow. The mind has its weather. Winter teaches the skill of noticing the better valleys, the lee side of the day, the hours when you do not ask too much of yourself and the hours when you do, because you must. Household routine is medicine in this pharmacy. Predictable tasks remove the winter's sharpest corners. Now we sweep. Now we spin. Now we trim the wick. Now we listen. Even children benefited from that grammar. They learned what came next so their private fears, always larger at night, as every age knows, had fewer corridors to run in. The house spoke to them in sequence and kindly consequence. You hang your mittens here, and in the morning they are dry. You bank the fire now, and in the morning it greets you. You share the story now, and someone will share one when yours runs out of breath. Love adjusted itself to the season. A glance meant, I put your cloak nearer the hearth than my own. A hand on a shoulder meant, the latch sticks, lift before you push so the cold will not steal anything when you open it. A brooch fastened a touch lower than fashion demanded meant, I saw you mending that shawl. Wear it like an honor, not a chore. Intimacy became a code of small services. and nothing kept the rooms more temperate than that unboastful generosity. The absence of a grand hearth left more space for these menders of spirit to do their work. Visitors from far households brought news that stretched the mind's legs. A story of a seal hunting cousin on a coast where the ice draws straight lines out to the horizon. A tale of a craft learned on a journey, of a new way to bind the heel of a sock so it does not wear through. A report of the aurora seen with such ferocity that the sky seemed made of trainable silk. Winter loves news. It keeps it like a secret that smiles, and shares portions when the mood begs. In this way, geography did not shrink with the cold. It changed its routes and continued to flow. Children's learning was tailored to the season. They practiced letters on a board wiped clean with snow. They learned sums by counting sticks for the morning fire. They took first, serious responsibility in guarded doses. Listen to the kettle and come tell me when it whispers. They learned to repair not just objects but moods, to bring a shawl without being asked, to notice when a lamp needs trimming, to offer a seat closer to the embers to a guest or a grandmother. This curriculum made winter citizens out of winter children. By spring, they were taller in ways more measurable than height. Even arguments, when they came, as they must in close quarters, learned winter manners. Voices lowered so the house itself would not grow nervous. Disputes met a schedule. We speak after chores. We do not steal warmth from the animals or the soup. Apologies were built like carpentry, with tight joinery and no drafts left between the words. Reconciliation often wore the face of a shared task finished faster than one person could have managed alone. Winter forgives, but it respects structure. A household that stays whole is one that keeps its edges smooth. Cold asks the body many questions, and none of them can be answered by fire alone. In a Viking winter, medicine was not a cabinet but a choreography of warmth, rest, food, herbs, steam, and the unglamorous discipline of cleanliness when water itself tries to turn to stone. Without a grand fireplace radiating spectacle, households learned a quieter radiance, the steady, preventative attention that keeps small troubles from becoming large ones. Health was not a miracle. It was a habit. Illness arrived in ordinary disguises, coughs that began as a tickle after a day of damp chores, joints that protested after a week of lifting and cold, stomachs that argued when preserved foods were too rich or too new. Winter crowded bodies together, lowering the walls between breaths. The very closeness that made warmth also invited contagion. The longhouse met this with arrangement before remedy. The sick were placed where air moved gently but not too far from warmth. Blankets were layered to chase shivers without smothering. A lamp sat near enough to be trimmed without stumbling. The person who'd banked coals for decades could bank a fever's edges, too, adding heat when chills rose. Easing covers when sweat finally came like a small change in the weather. Herbs stood in jars and bunches like a quiet company of specialists. Angelica for strength, yarrow for fevers and wounds, thyme and wild mint for lungs and the deep, rough coughs that winter cultivates. Juniper berries, sharp as little black truths, flavoured broths, and made the air cleaner when thrown in a handful at the edge of coals. Birch leaves and bark remembered summer circulation. Willow offered its plain, bitter kindness to aching joints. Garlic and onion were winter doctors disguised as kitchen staff, sliced into soups not only for taste but for the way they asked the breath to open and the blood to move. Even fermented foods, sour milk, pickled roots, served as physicians of the gut, teaching the body how to keep its own peace when fresh greens were a memory. Steam was a negotiator between winter and the chest. A pot simmered with thyme, juniper, and a shred of pine resin could be moved to a stool. A cloth tented over the head and the pot. The patient breathed patience in and coughed winter out. Eucalyptus did not live here, but northern cousins did their best, and the longhouse learned the rhythm. Inhale slowly, exhale with intention, pause if the head swims, sip warm water, rest. For children, the tent became a small theatre, lamplight soft through cloth, mother or father's hand slow on the back, the steam's whisper turning the room into a gentler weather. Lamp smoke trimmed cleanly. Hearth smoke kept obedient. The air was managed as carefully as any diet. Bathing was less a spectacle than a sequence. Water took warming, warming took fuel, and fuel took summer to prepare. The math taught restraint without surrender. Faces were washed each morning with water brought just shy of hot, hands often, feet as needed, because cold sneaks quickest through damp socks and neglected toes. Full bathing came in turns, on days when chores and woodpile agreed. A tub near the hearth, a privacy of screens or careful schedules, scented, if fortune allowed, with a pinch of dried herbs. In some places, a sweat bath, stones heated, water dashed, steam made, lifted winter heaviness from lungs and skin alike, followed by brief, brave air and a furious rub-down that woke the blood like a bell. Clean does not mean extravagant. It means thorough, and winter respects thorough. Clothing was medicine when it was dry. Damp will turns ally into adversary. So the house waged war on wet. Mittens were turned inside out and aired. Socks hung high where ascending heat does the work slowly. Boots treated with fat until leather drank no more and began to shine in the lamplight like a well-fed seal. Caps were set on pegs so they would not hide in shadows and go forgotten. A day's sweat, caught in underlinen, was changed when possible, because the body's own salt can chill it if invited to stay. These rituals made the difference between a cough that visits and a cough that moves in. Sleep healed more surely than most draughts poured from jars. The longhouse honoured it. Tasks drawn inward earlier on the hard days, lamps trimmed low, voices treading lightly so the sick could move inside the wider sleep that waits at the edge of fever. First sleep and second sleep, those twin nights in one, were managed with the sick in mind. Broths reheated quietly at the midpoint, a cap pulled back down, a blanket adjusted not to weight the chest. Children learned that quiet is a gift. They delivered it with pride. A household that sleeps well saves fuel, saves tempers, and saves bodies from the kind of wear that sickness easily exploits. Diet sharpened its edge for illness. A strong person can meet winter with dense fats and salted meats. A sick person does better with warm broths, barley thin to kindness, whey, and sour milk to ease the gut and steady thirst. Honey, where the bees had been busy in summer, soothed throats and made herbs more persuasive. A piece of dried apple softened in hot water turned into a tiny holiday for a mouth gone dull with fever. Salt balanced carefully, enough to replace what sweat took, not so much that a tired body had to argue with its own blood. In the worst coughs, smoke was a quiet enemy. So the pot moved to the coal sober side, lid stayed on, shutters opened a finger's breadth and then closed again when air felt right. The house breathes, the lungs breathe. Keep them in conversation, tools for tending stood ready. A cloth wrung warm and set on a cheek where a tooth railed against the cold. A salve of tallow and resin rubbed into a chest. A little bag of heated sand wrapped and placed to soothe a crampy belly. Needles set aside for mending cloth took turns closing skin when an accident asked. Knives cleaned in boiling water and cooled returned to service with the gravity of surgeons. Wound care was simple and cautious. Clean with warm water, salt, or yarrow washes. Keep covered but let the air's honesty in at the right times. Infection was a winter scavenger. The house learned to starve it with neatness and patience. Air itself needed guarding. A tight house is warm but can grow wet. A wet house makes coughs fat and hard to move. Brief venting, 2 minutes, shutters open, door propped, a broom waved once through the doorway to persuade the heavy air out, then close, warmth saved. Sometimes, in days of thick smoke and thick weather, the patient was moved closer to the eave's gentlest leak of air, where lungs could do subtler work. Children were taught to notice their own breath. If talking makes you cough, talk less. If laughing becomes a storm, let the story wait. If your chest feels narrow, come nearer to warmth and sit tall. Mind and mood were not luxuries. They were medicine with long half-lives. Fear makes breathing shallow and nights long. So the old told stories that bent fear into awe, how the great cold comes and goes, how people before you slept and woke and saw spring, how the aurora walks as a sign that the sky still remembers colour even now. A scald's poem becomes a sedative. A song in a key the patient likes loosens a back that otherwise clenches and steals rest. A game played beside the bed, counting breaths, counting beats of a drum, counting stitches, turns worry into number, and number is tamer than the shapeless. Even a well-timed joke is an herb, one that thins the blood of dread quarantine, in a word not yet named as such, was practiced in the clearest ways a small space allows. A sick child's cup was theirs alone. A spoon was scalded and set aside. Bedding changed when sweat had made it lose its warmth. Those who had been near the patient washed hands in warm water with ash or the last of the mild soap saved from fat and lye. The lamp's metal pin and scissor ends were wiped. Visitors were welcomed at the threshold and sent away with kindness if the cough inside was catching. News is never so urgent that it must bring a fever with it. These small fences kept the house from falling like matched trees in a wind. When death came, and winter demanded a certain tax, it was met with dignity that kept the living from breaking. The body was washed with warmed water, the room aired, the bedding changed, the house reset to the order that tells the mind the world still has shape. Mourners were given warm drinks, simple food, gentle tasks, and more sleep than ordinary days would permit. Grief is work. The house rearranged itself so that work could be done without stealing too much from the body's own reserves. Tradition placed a branch here, a candle there, a story at dusk that folded the life into the saga of the place. In time, laughter trickled back, not as betrayal but as compliance with the law winter sets. Continue, recovery had its own rituals. First, the cautious return to heavier foods. Then, the walk to the door, the first lungful of air without coughing. The small triumph of a task done, winding yarn, sharpening a knife, banking the fire at night. The patient's place on the bench moved gradually away from the hearth's core. The extra blanket was folded and set aside like a medal. Children were taught to see recovery not as an instant but as a braid of moments, and to reward each with ordinary pleasures. A story chosen, a place at the game, a mitt laid warm on the bed before sleep. If the longhouse was a body, its buyer was the steady, rumbling heart. Winter in the Viking world was not borne by people alone. It was carried, day after day, by animals whose breath misted the air and whose quiet industry turned fodder into strength, milk, hide, and heat. Without a grand, stone fireplace to dominate the room, warmth was apportioned in subtler ways. And one of the surest was the presence of living creatures kept close, tended carefully, and folded into the household's calculations as partners rather than mere property. The buyer was work, yes, but it was also insurance, against hunger, against isolation, against the kind of cold that seeps into bones and doubts. The architecture of a good buyer was humble and precise. Where space allowed, it was attached to the longhouse or sheltered by a shared wall so that warmth moved in both directions. Livestock easing the people's nights and people's fire keeping ice from making a kingdom over the water buckets. Stalls were arranged with a logic of reach and rhythm, milking cows nearest the door where morning's first light could find them. Sheep clustered together so their flock mind would settle. Goats secured where their curious horns could not invent mischief with tool handles and hanging ropes. The floor sloped almost imperceptibly to a shallow gutter, not enough to trip a sleepy step in dusk, enough to draw waste toward a pit that winter turned into a patient alchemy for spring fields. Bedding was its own craft. Straw laid thick to begin, then renewed in layers, the deep litter quietly generating its own low heat as clean straw covered what had been soiled. Forks learned the difference between turning and removing, between freshening the surface so hooves stayed dry and carding the heavy. Steaming richness to a protected heap outside where snow capped it like a chef's hat and steam rose even on days when breath looked weak. Dryness was not luxury. It was medicine. Damp hooves mean illness, damp bellies mean coughs, damp hides mean a chill that spends a precious store of feed. So the pitchfork moved like a metronome, and the buyer exhaled a smell both strong and oddly reassuring. Life, transforming, fodder was accounting performed with pitchforks. Hay, cut and stacked in high summer, was fed with a precision that had nothing to do with stinginess and everything to do with promises made to the future. Nets and racks kept the feed off the floor where clumsy hooves would turn it into waste. Small bundles were preferred to large spills, because animals, like people, are less likely to squander what's portioned thoughtfully. Root vegetables, turnips, beets, swedes, were sliced and par-cooked for older animals whose teeth argued with winter. A pinch of salt, a bucket of warmed water, and the slow, content crunching that follows was its own kind of evening hymn. Even the act of soaking fodder in warm water was heat redistribution by another name. Fuel became digestibility, and digestibility returned as strength and milk. Water was a clock that could not fail. Buckets froze at their lips and demanded breaking. Troughs needed a wooden lid or a floating disc to keep the ice thin enough to dismiss with a gloved knuckle. In the harshest weeks, water was carried hot to become merely warm by the time it reached the stall, economy wrapped in kindness. A cow that drinks well keeps her milk. A sheep that drinks well keeps her health. A horse that drinks well keeps its patience. The person who tended water at dawn and dusk held a quiet seniority in the household, trusted with a duty that acknowledged how the winter's ledger balances, gallon by gallon. Not in poems. Milking in winter was a chapel service, regular, gentle, unhurried in the ways that matter. Teats were warmed between hands before the first squeeze so the body would not flinch and spend the day sulking. A clean cloth wiped away chaff and the small realities of bedding. The bucket sat where a hoof was less likely to argue with it. Milk steamed in the chill air, white as breath, and the room sounds fell into a familiar chord. The stretch of a rope, the soft thud of a wooden pail set down, the animal's slower winter chewing. Milk that didn't go to children and the sick became butter when the house could afford the churn's demand, or was fermented into sturdier forms that lasted and lasted. Ways of eating summer on a night that felt like the world had forgotten the color green manure. Winter's and gentle gift was a treasury in disguise. Forked into neat heaps, kept under straw and snow, it composite like a stove turned very low. Steam rose on clear days as if the ground itself held secret coals. In spring, this became the grammar of fields, phrases of fertility laid down where barley would read them, where flax would stretch, where vegetables would pull sweetness from soil that winter had made ready. Nothing was waste. The house learned to see usefulness where eyes in softer climates see only chore. Animal health was husbandry and housekeeping braided together. Ears were read, whether they listed with tiredness or stood their comfortable, conversational ways. Noses were checked for clear shine instead of dryness, for breath that smelled like grass remembered rather than ferment gone wrong. Hooves were cleaned and pared on a schedule that kept them honest. Hides were brushed to lift dust and stimulate blood. Tails were combed so that swishes were more courtesy than complaint. A cough in the byre provoked the same suite of responses as a cough on the bench. More bedding. A better draught. A little juniper on coals nearby to sweeten the air. And the kind discipline of observation recorded in a mind that knew last winter. And the one before, births did not ask spring's permission. Lambing could arrive on a night when wind pressed its palm against the door and the roof muddied under new snow. The byre learned to become a nursery, a corner curtained by straw bales, a lantern set where it would serve and not blind, hands redded with clean cloths warmed near the hearth. The practical miracles were well rehearsed. Clear the mouth. Rub until shiver becomes shudder becomes breath. Guide the teat gently to a mouth still surprised by the world. Step back while the mother's instincts reduce human importance to the right size. On such mornings, milk tasted sweeter, or perhaps the tongue remembered better. The whole household walked a little lighter between door and byre. There were the animals that carried winter on their backs in other ways, dogs trained to understand the sled's pulling, to keep pace without spending more than a body can afford. Cats tuned to the liturgy of granaries, guarding grain bins from small teeth that would nibble not just food but the future. Horses whose steam rose like banners and whose patience with the season made roads possible. Their diets and rest were adjusted with tact, more fat after the longest treks. A dry rub-down that turned sweat to comfort. A thicker bed where ribs had worked hard against leather, tools for the byre were kept in a civility equal to their importance. The fork's tines were checked for the signature bend that foretells a break. The shovel's edge sharpened so packed straw parted neatly. The milking stool mended immediately if a leg went squirrely, because no one argues with a cow from the floor. Ropes were hung where mice could not find them and where hands sleepy with mourning would not. A dull blade is wasted breath. A misplaced halter is wasted time, and time, in the bite of a winter night, is warmth. This was not a romance of animal life. It was a marriage of necessity and affection. Names were given more often than tally marks. Losses were met with the sorrow kept tidy by chores. Old animals that had carried many winters were touched with a reverence no songs were written about because it sat too near to the day's hard edges. When slaughter came in autumn, the gratitude was practical. All parts used, fat rendered for lamps and pans, sinew saved, bones boiled until marrow told its last story. In winter, the hard arithmetic softened slightly into companionship, routines that comfort both species. Small courtesies returned by eyes that grew calm when familiar boots approached. Air in the byre needed as much intelligence as air in the longhouse. Too tight, and lungs faltered. Too loose, and hooves stood on frost. Low openings took the heavy, damp breath slowly out. Roof seams lifted a finger to let ammonia drift and vanish into the larger weather. On the coldest days, vents were closed and then opened in time pulses, the way a good cook lifts a lid to let steam escape and then persuades flavour back into the pot. The mind that managed the hearth managed the stalls, with the gentleness of someone who understands that warmth is not a number on a scale but the behaviour of a room and the tally of the season. Livestock turned winter into solvable problems. They shared warmth, they stood between hunger and the table with a firm back, they made work worth doing and mornings worth rising for. The absence of a fireplace made this more obvious, not less. The house's heat was not a single flame but a society of warm bodies, human and animal, cooperating. When the final snow sank and the world exhaled mud and promises, animals filed out to pasture with a relief that sounded like bells. The byre was cleaned down to its bones. The pitchfork leaned like a veteran allowed a brief rest, and the household, counting its living inventory with the same gratitude it used to count its sacks of grain, felt rich in the only way winter recognizes, all together, all upright, all ready for the next page of light. Winter thins the noise of the world until only essentials remain: breath, snow, wood, and the small sounds that mean food. In the Viking North, where the sea and the land took turns holding their doors ajar, the season did not close the larder. It changed the way one approached its shelves. Without a showy fireplace to make comfort into spectacle, comfort became the steady confidence that there would be something hot to ladle by evening. That confidence was built outdoors, in rooms roofed with sky, at a hole in the ice where water smoked like a hidden animal, in a copse tracked by hare and fox, along the windy margins where sea met shore and left its winter signatures. Hunting and fishing in these months were less a contest than a conversation held in low voices, a question asked of the cold, an answer offered by patience. The ice was a door one learned to knock upon properly. Before any hole was cut, the thickness was red, the way the colour changed from blue to black, the way air bubbles arranged themselves like freckles under the skin, the way a staff drove and stopped. A cautious hole began small and widened, its edges beveled with a knife so they would not saw at line or net. A circle of slush was lifted with a ladle and thrown aside. The cold refroze the spatter into tiny stars that glittered around the work like a crown. A low stool, a board across the knees, and the fisherman settled into a posture winter recognizes as respect, still, compact, making no argument against the air. Just offering it time in exchange for a meal, lines went down. Their hooks baited plain, strips of fish or bits of gut. Nothing wasted in a season that memorized inventories. Patience, here, had a technique. A jig answered the slow clock the water keeps under ice, a dance accomplished with fingers inside mittens, a rhythm learned from elders. Lift, pause, breathe, lower, pause, breathe. The fish that lived this time of year were not drunk on summer plenty. They were careful, too. A strike felt like a thought crossing a mind. The rod lifted, the line stiffened, the hole bloomed steam. And a living body from the black winter beneath came up into the white winter above. Where a household had help enough to try bigger work, nets moved under ice in quiet geometries. 2 holes, then 3, cut along a measured line. A guide rope threaded with a pole or a weighted messenger, nudged from one mouth of ice to the next. The net's lead line sank obediently. The floats puffed their little chests, and the water resumed its silence around the trap. Hours later or the next morning, the line was hauled, slow and even, as if winter itself might be offended by haste. Fish knocked their heads softly against the ice's edge as they rose. A hand, bare only the instant it must be, freed each one to a waiting basket lined with straw that absorbed wet and preserved dignity. Net mending was wintercraft, twine, needles, eyes sharpened by lamplight. A good net is a promise made to tomorrow. On coasts and along fjords, the sea remained the household's stern ally. Storms were judges. Clear days, rare invitations. Men and women did not court the sea's anger in winter with the swagger of summer. They went out as one might enter a church, purposeful, aware of the larger thing that must be respected. Lines dropped from a boat's side into water that held its own slate-grey light. Hands worked as if they were not cold. Breath formed small, private veils over the bow. The return was announced not with shouting but with a sled creaking under weight, with gulls envious above the yard. Fish went to racks to become stockfish again, or to brine, or straight to the kettle. Scales scattered like silver confetti no one had time to admire. Hunting favoured the silhouette, the narrow hours of dawn and dusk when cold air holds still and outlines sharpen. Tracks wrote their diaries in the snow, hares' tidy ovals, foxes' orderly thoughts, the hunched script of a bird that landed, reconsidered, and lifted. Snares took their places along these stories, not randomly but as punctuation. Here a loop where a path narrowed, there where shelter and forage created a habit. A snare's virtue is that it works while the household does other things. Its success is not a lottery but a lecture you learned in autumn. How to play scent. How to lay the brush that guides without arousing suspicion. How to read a fresh track from an old one so you are not arguing with yesterday's truth. For larger game, where custom, landscape, and fortune permitted, bough spoke in winter's hush. The archer became a moving stone, edges softened by a cloak of dull wool, steps placed in the footprints of the person ahead. Wind was a teacher. Stay upwind and you teach the animal. Stay crosswind or downwind and you may learn what you came to learn. Arrows were checked for quiet, the fletching trimmed so it would not hiss, the heads lashed so they would not rattle. A clean shot answered winter's aesthetic, efficient, unsentimental, ready to be followed by the swift. Respectful work that turns a fallen body into food, clothing, and a dozen small. Useful futures, birds offered a different arithmetic. Netting at roosts, where the law of the land allowed it, or taking waterfowl at openings kept by springs. These were gambles weighted by knowledge rather than luck. A decoy could be carved in winter evenings. Nothing elaborate, just the posture remembered from a day when the ice wore a leaden rain and the birds huddled. In the take came feathers for bedding's lighter layer, bones for needles and useful points, fat for lamps and for pans. Even beaks and talons had their quiet uses, as toggles or closures or merely as charms that children valued because they verified the reality of stories seal and other marine. Hunts, their methods knit to particular coasts and peoples, were winter's most dangerous transactions. With the world beyond the door, breathing holes were known and respected. Approaches were made low, with patience that felt like prayer. Success was measured in months of oil, in skins that became boots and lines and watertight things. Elders told such stories carefully, without bravado, and included the cost alongside the gain, because winter teaches that victory and loss are neighbours. Tools were kept like confidants. The auger's teeth were watched for the first hint of dullness. The spear's barbs were tested against a strand of hair. The trap's trigger was rubbed with ash so no scent of the house announced itself. Lines were coiled and stored high, away from mice and the curiosity of cats who served the barn in their own war and, in their off hours, shared the longhouse's benches with proprietary gravity. A good kit for winter hunting and fishing felt like a pocket version of the household, strong where it needed to be, modest where it could afford to be, and always ready to mend itself as soon as a flaw declared itself. The ethics of winter taking war practical faces. You do not empty a run of all its hair. You do not fish a hole until it feels like you have ripped a word from a sentence. Children were taught to lift a snare that had worked and leave the place to rest. To thank the water with the half-remembered words elders used, not because water understands language, but because people do, and language shapes what the hand chooses next. Waste was unthinkable. Bones became broth twice and 3 times. Hides were scraped and stretched until they held the usefulness of a wall. Sinew turned into thread that bore winter's signature toughness into garments and gear. Weather wrote the calendar more strictly than any saint's day. A day of thick, falling snow made the woods soft and soundless. Snares were checked quickly and re-sighted according to the new map. A day of knife-cold and bright blue sky pushed fishing to the fore, with holes that steamed so earnestly you could almost imagine it was summer fog. Wind from the wrong quarter shut down everything and taught humility. Plans became indoor chores, and the house praised its own patience with a little extra lamplight and a song that told the truth about waiting. The return from winter's provisioning rarely looked triumphant. It looked relieved, competent, a little frosted. The door curtain lifted and the longhouse leaned its warmth forward by a hand's breadth to meet the cheeks and fingers that had been outside. The story of the day: how the fox outthought the snare and so earned itself another evening. How the ice sang like a harp but held. How the line went tight and for a breath you felt the exact size of the fish that would become tonight's broth, unspooled into the air and joined the hanging herbs and the smell of wool and wood. In the pot, snow-melted water listened for the fish's arrival. A bowl of barley-remembered summer fields. The house, having sent a person out, now gathered them back and finished the day's sentence. Be why this rhythm: winter's larder did not overflow. It stayed simply non-empty. That is a kind of abundance the North respects more than swaggering plenty. To take enough, to waste nothing, to accept that some days bring only skill and not reward. These were the quiet commandments of the season. The absence of a grand fireplace underscored the lesson. Warmth and food were not spectacles. They were continuities, produced by attention and returned to by gratitude. In a few months the rivers would muscle out of their armor and the woods would fill with the fussy talk of birds. For now, a hole steamed, a snare waited, a net drank the dark, and the house, fed again, let its lamp draw a small sun upon the bench. When the fields retired under their white blankets and the boats drowsed with ice at their ribs, work did not stop. It moved indoors and became precise. Winter in the Viking home turned the longhouse into a workshop of soft rhythms and quiet tools, where necessity guided the hand and patience guided the eye. Without a mantle-framed fireplace to stage a spectacle, warmth gathered in smaller circles, at the loom's foot, at the bench where a knife lifted thin curls from a board, at the low stool where a needle, in bone, in iron, stitched its tidy miles. These industries were not merely ways to pass time. They were the household's second harvest, the slow growth of things that would carry the family through the next bright seasons. The loom was winter's tallest tool. Upright and modestly monumental, it stood like a friendly tree sprouted from the planks, its warped threads weighted and humming with potential. Wool, carded until its crimps aligned like small, disciplined waves, became yarn under the spindle's patient spin. Twist, feed, twist again, the thread sliding through fingers that learn to judge tension by feel the way the tongue judges the heat of soup. At the loom, a song settled into the mechanics: lift the shed, pass the weft, beat it home, and cloth accumulated like snow in quiet drifts. Patterns travelled not on paper but in memory and in pebbled sequences of colour that elders taught by pointing. Here, 2. Here, 3. Now change. A strip of tablet weaving edged a cloak so it would resist fray. A bolt of plain weaved promised shirts that would breathe kindly in summer and lay obediently in winter. Nail binding, older than knitting, made winter garments that refused to come undone. A single needle and short lengths of yarn looped through and around the thumb's memory until fabric thickened into something that made hands brave and feet clever. Mittens grew from a circle and learned the shape of the person who wore them. Socks grew from a toe and listened for the heel. The beauty was not ornament but security. A worn place could be mended without chasing ladders to the horizon, and a mitten thinned by work could be thickened at the palm with a second skin like a quiet oath. Children, watching, learned to make cords first, useful for everything from tying a bundle to reserving a page in the mind that said, "I made this. It holds." Leatherwork took its turn near the heeled coals. Boots complained after months of use, and winter made them honest by showing exactly where. Seams were opened, daubed with fat and resin, pressed and pricked and sewn again with waxed thread that went through holes the all negotiated in a neat line. Soles found new companions in patches cut to shape and smoothed until the foot forgot the join. Belts were cut and punched. Scabbards and sheaths relined so that damp would find nowhere to begin an argument. A good leather smell joined the catalogue of winter scents: smoke, wool, herbs, tallow. Speaking of a comfort that isn't softness but reliability, wood, always a partner, yielded to knives and small planes. A spoon's bowl deepened until it could keep a reasonable promise to a mouth. The handle thinned where fingers liked to rest. The back was rounded to slide through washing water without hiding scraps that later would sour. Stools shrugged off their wobble under a careful eye and a wedge tapped true. A chest split was persuaded shut and held by a butterfly key that turned a scar into a signature. Ship planks, if a household had them resting for spring, were examined the way one examines sentences, for cracks in meaning. Tar warmed and brushed into seams felt like writing a good ending you will be glad to meet again when ice releases the boats. Metal talk was smaller in winter but not absent. A portable forge, if fuel allowed, coaxed nails back to straight and tools back to sharp. The sound of a light hammer striking a peen over anvil iron folded nicely into the longhouse's music. Loom, lamp, breath, tap. Knives asked to be reminded of their purpose. A hook for the hearth chain asked for a fresh jaw. A buckled hinge confessed its fatigue and received a small brace. The discipline of edge and temper lived, too. In the whetstone passed lovingly over blades and strokes that felt like smoothing a child's hair, steady, even, persuasive rather than violent, bone and horn. Generous after autumn's reckonings, became winter's nimble mediums. Needles with eyes polished until threads slid like conversation. Toggles that closed cloaks with the satisfaction of click and hold. Combs with teeth judiciously spaced for hair or for carding wool. A spindle whirl whose weight made yarn tell the truth. Children learned the quick apprenticeship bone allows. A whistle carved from a bird bone to call a sibling from the byre. A small charm cut to watch a sleeping place. Game pieces shaped on a rainy day when travel made no sense. Nothing wasted. Everything with a second life if patience was willing. Rope and cord were spun with winter minds, counting, repeating, measuring. Hemp or flax when possible, wool when necessary, gut where strength must be small but fierce. A twisted pair became a 3-strand. 3 became 4. A splice swallowed its own tail and vanished into smooth continuity that would not snag on the world. Nets took repair with a grace that taught humility. 100 small fixes are better than a glorious failure. Lines for sleds, halters for animals. Lashings for bundles. Winter is an argument with friction and leverage, and cordage is its plane. Trustworthy language. The repair economy spoke politely from every bench. A cracked pot with a wire staple closed across its wound. A bucket given a new stave that made the hoop sit right again. A window shutter planed to quiet the chatter it developed in a particular wind. Cloth darned with language the eye can barely read. Little ladders thrown across a gap, little bridges arched. A cloak's tired hem turned up anew, hiding its fray and turning it into strength. A brooch bent pin heated, straightened, and rubbed with tallow so it would slip and bite just so. The idea was never make it like new so much as make it trustworthy. Winter respects that distinction. Order was the invisible tool. Pegs took on responsibility. This hook for lamp tools, that one for the hearth rake, this for the awl and the small bag of spare needles and bone pins. The loom shuttle slept where it could be found by anyone at dawn. The whetstone returned to its shelf as if it had always lived there. Clean benches made warm rooms because they shortened searches and saved tempers, and there is no fuel like peace when the days are short. The longhouse, when it works well, is a map with very few lies. Everything belongs, and belonging means less heat spent finding, teaching threaded through the work like weft through warp. Small hands tugged a shuttle and learned the logic of edges. A child's first nail-bound wristband, lumpy and proud, took its place in a drawer waiting for a future fit. A boy or girl shaped a spoon and, at supper, found it in their own bowl, a ceremony of competence. Elders watched from the best light, corrective without sharpness, a pin placed before a mistake was made, a story told about the first time they got this wrong and how the fix was kinder than the error. Winter's academy is rigorous and gentle. Mastery is warmth you can touch. Trade and barter moved along these benches even when feet stayed home. A neighbor needed a strap and had onion to spare. Another had blue dye from last summer's woad to exchange for a small repair to a broken loom weight. A visiting cousin had a trick for braiding sling cords that gripped stones like certainty. In return, he learned a better way to set a net's headline so gulls would not find it worth their attention. Goods traveled folded in cloaks, tucked into sleds, wrapped in oiled skin against snow, and stories traveled with them, what the road was like, how the wind behaved along the ridge today, whose sheep had lambed early and with what luck. Craft is an economy and a language both. Time kept shape around these tasks. Morning belonged to the loud jobs, planing, tapping, the forged brief conversation, when children were wakeful and laughter absorbed noise into joy. Afternoon sank into threads and tiny stitches. Evening gave the loom its most hypnotic authority, while lamps pulled light where needed and coals gave a red, consenting hum. Between first sleep and second. Some jobs fitted exactly. Trimming wicks, laying out tomorrow's warp. Counting the rows on a mitten so both hands would match not only in size but in their stories of how they were made. The absence of a showy fireplace meant there was more room for work to sit closer together. People and tools shared the same weather, the same lamp circle, the same draft to be tamed, the same pauses for tea-coloured broth. Conversation turned into another tool, sharp when it must teach, soft when it must soothe, funny when a knot refused to yield until laughter shook it loose. A house full of useful sound, shuttle, plane, shears, spindle, is a house that forgets to be lonely. And forgetfulness of loneliness is one of winter's most healing arts. When spring finally leaned on the door, the inventory looked like a miracle earned. Socks with sound heels, cloaks with hems that would not drink mud, spoons that did not splinter, ropes full of good manners, a loom resting, weight lightened, a bench wiped, a forge content. Boats would wake, fields would open their ribs to seed, paths would broaden and get noisy with birds. The winter work stayed humble, as always, but its results were everywhere. Quiet competences folded into daily life, invisible until the moment they prevented a problem from becoming a crisis. That is the precise definition of warmth in hard countries. Something you did months ago that makes today easier without demanding applause. Winter is an accountant with a very tidy book. Every scoop from the grain chest gets written somewhere. If not with ink, then with the small, solemn click of a lid that falls a fraction lower than it did last week. In a Viking longhouse, where heat was a low discipline rather than a high spectacle, survival depended on the quiet mathematics of stores and the social arithmetic that joined one house to the next. Without a grand fireplace to hypnotize or to hide wasteful habits in its theatrical glow, people learned to see comfort as numbers and promises, a bin at a certain line, a stack at a certain height, a neighbor who will come if you knock. A door that opens when you do. Counting began at the threshold of the pantry, an empire made of simple things. Sacks of barley and oats were stacked with their mouths turned inward against mice and casual glances. A slate of horns scratched with marks no stranger could read told the household's living totals. Dried fish hung from a beam where its weight could be judged by the hand that had lifted it every week since autumn. Light means a stew, still heavy means a feast, never empty means wisdom. Salt told a longer story in its crock, evading damp and clinging, as if it also knew that spring comes more surely to a house that can season food to the point where the body wants to eat. Honey, if any remained, lived near the lamp wicks. Sweetness carried a duty to choose its moment. Fortifying a cough, cheering a guest, being, just once, the generous end of a hard day. The ledger was not a tyrant. It was a companion whose advice was worth taking. A notchstick kept near the grains told the number of ladles left at a ration that would carry 4 people to thaw. When guests came, the stick moved in wider steps with a double meaning. We will eat more tonight, and tonight we will also add a page to the book of favors. Fat jars and buttercrocks worked by feel. Press a thumb, turn the pot, listen to the small moist sound that tells you if you've been bowled too often. Children learned to read these signs like letters. Not through lectures but by participating. The way a scoop rests on the rim at a precise angle. The way lids that fit properly waste fewer breaths of warmth. Barter braided one household's ledger with another's until the village became a single mathematics. A strap mended here for a packet of turnips from there. A skein of wool traded for a day's help pulling sleds when the woodpile looked daunting under its white hat. A pot of sour milk exchanged for 2 nights' use of a better soccer dax. In winter, when distance grew heavy and doorways felt like islands, these trades were ferries running on time. They carried small jokes and large courtesies along with goods. A story about the fox that refused to respect snares. A compliment for the new edge on a neighbor's knife. A reminder, given gently, that the path to the buyer has iced slick at the middle and should be sanded. Such talk is not noise. It is oil for the village engine. The law was winter's other ledger, less visible, equally strict, and born not just of kings or distant assemblies but of doors and hands. Hospitality was a rule as old as frost. A person in need, entering at dusk with snow on their cloak and that tilt to the shoulders that means they are carrying a day that weighed too much, must be warmed and fed. It was not saintliness. It was self-interest practiced with grace. Because winter moves fortunes around like pieces on a board, and no house can guarantee it will never be the one that needs help. The law of the door, elders said, and meant, we survived together or not at all. The fire was banked low, but a log could be spared. The lamp burned modestly, but its circle widened for whoever joined IT the same time. Scarcity suggested its own careful laws. You did not come to a house at night smelling like ale and ask for more. You did not speak loudly in the pantry or count your neighbor's stores with your eyes. You looked where you were invited to look. You praised the bread without measuring the basket. Envy is a draught that steals heat, so winter cultivated manners that plugged it, the praise of well-kept tools rather than full shelves, the compliment to skill rather than wealth, the habit of sending someone away with something small and practical in their hand so gratitude had an object and could not turn into debt that curdles, the thing, the assembly where disputes settled and futures were debated, kept its own winter timetable. In deep cold, the thing might be smaller, held in a hall where benches could hold both speech and steam from cups. Law speakers, with memories like braided rope, uncoiled precedents and retied them for today's problem. The fence that moved when drifts pushed and now pens sheep on the wrong side. The share in a fishing ground when the ice makes different channels this year. The promise of a marriage portion when the store of goats is thinned. Oaths, when they were sworn, stood like tall pegs. A hand on a ring, words said so cleanly that winter itself seemed to pause and listen. Not because the gods would punish a lie instantly, but because the village would. And because lies draft warmth out of houses faster than any broken window. Household governance, as unglamorous as sweeping and as necessary, gave the ledger its spine. Rations were set and reviewed. Festival was a word not erased but modified. A circle in the calendar that shrank to fit the year's means and grew in storytelling if it could not grow in meat. Work was distributed with an eye on temper and strength. A back made sore by the last loading of wood deserves a day at the loom. A restless youth gets the errand that crosses the ridge so the house does not fill with jangling energy. Elders' advice counted more in winter because they had survived more winters, and survival is a degree you do not counterfeit. Debt took honest shapes. A neighbor leaves your door with a repaired shoe and says, in spring, when the thicket softens, I'll bring willow for your basket frames. That is a winter promissory note written not on paper but in the mind, payable when the world turns green. Sometimes debt became a story you wanted to be in. Remember how Hild let us share her lamp after ours cracked? Bring her the first SKYR when the new milk comes. Children, hearing such plans, learn that obligation is not a chain but a braid, stronger and kinder than what one household can twist alone. There were also the ledger's darker marks. A bin of grain that fell faster than it should. A root cellar that wept salt tears because its seal was not tight. A barrel of brine that bloomed the wrong sort of life. Each of these made a page called mistake, and winter taught the art of owning it quickly. Close the gap, move the barrel, share the loss in words before it must be shared in hunger. Shame is lighter when it is early. Secrets become heavy and drag families into arguments with the season that they cannot win. Confession grew practical in winter, We miscounted. Can we trade labor for grain? Such sentences are doors kept open against a weather that otherwise will get in. Patterns of giving were architecture, not decoration. The widow with the weak roof received help before the storm. That is cheaper than rescue after. The boy with the clever fingers got a bone needle kit and a few hours of instruction from the household that had extra. That is cheaper than supporting a man who never learned to sew his own mittens. Investment disguised as kindness, kindness disguised as common sense. This was winter's economics. And when something extravagant appeared, someone walking with a new bit of bright metal, a pelt too luscious for its context, the ledger raised its eyebrow. Extravagance is a draft, too. Left open, it sucks warmth from a dozen corners. Counting time itself was part of counting stores. The year pivoted at midwinter, and people felt the hinge. A feast might be held with deliberation, eating into stores in a way that multiplied morale enough to pay the debt later in cheerfully done chores and mended tempers. A small charm laid on a beam, a green twig brought near the hearth. These were interest payments to hope. The skald who told the longer saga found a way, at the turn, to speak of trials survived and of the crooked path the sun must take before it learns to rise early again. The ledger has a poetry. It is very quiet, but people hear it. Above all, the law of the door watched over everything. A door that opens too easily in winter loses a house. A door that does not open loses a soul. The balance was a curtain and a latch and a culture of noticing. When footsteps hesitated outside, someone called out before knocking chilled hands could think they were unwelcome. When the room grew crowded, a bench made room without size. When the household had a lean day, a guest saw it and praised something that cost nothing, the evenness of a weave, the neatness of a shutter, so the host's pride could feed on that instead of on food that would have to be bought back tomorrow with labor they did not have. Spring, when it came, would audit the winter. Fields forced a reckoning. How much barley remains? How much seed can be spared? How many hands are strong enough to do the work because winter did not overdraw their accounts of sleep and spirit? The longhouse, if it had kept its ledger in the old ways, generosity without display, frugality without meanness, rules without cruelty, had nothing to fear from the arithmetic. The door would open later that year and children would run out into light they could finally trust. And someone would say, "We did well," not with triumph, but with the same modest satisfaction used for everything else in that season. A bowl filled, a seam strengthened, a promise kept. Not all northern winters are the same, though they rhyme. A gale that prowls an Icelandic valley does not wear the exact face of a storm slipping down a Norwegian fjord. Snow that powders a Greenland headland settles differently than the heavy, wet drifts that slump through coastal forests. The people of the Viking world understood this, and their houses understood it, too. Without the grand, chimneyed fireplaces of later centuries, warmth had to be coaxed from design, from materials a hand, and from the long memory a place keeps about what works. The longhouse was a shared idea, but its dialects multiplied as you sailed west, turned inland, or crossed to islands where the wind had its own handwriting. Survival, then, was local knowledge written in turf and timber, stone and sod, moss, and the small adjustments that separate a cold night from a dangerous one. Iceland, turf that remembers summer in Iceland. Wood was scarce, wind was confident, and the ground itself offered the best insulation if you invited it up onto the roof and into the walls. Turf houses grew out of this polite bargain with the earth. First, a frame, driftwood, treasured beams reused across generations, or short timbers spliced with clever joinery, because a straight, long tree was a guest, not a neighbor. Along that skeleton, walls were raised with stacked turf bricks, cut with a spade so grass and root held together, laid in offset courses that locked like fingers. Between layers, the builders slipped birch bark or straw. Materials that hate water's mischief and teach it to run down and away. A turf roof began as carpentry and ended as gardening. Birch bark laid over boards. Then sod returned to the sky in interlocking slabs, seams staggered. The living roots stitched the roof to itself. The soil trapped slow air. The grass, which remembered wind from its field days, learned to shrug rain and snow with the same shrug it had used in summer. Snow in winter made the whole affair warmer, turning the house into a quiet, breathing hill. Windows were few, modest ovals washed with light through oiled skin or thin horn. Shutters answered the truth that storms come sideways in Iceland. And that light must be a disciplined guest. Not a door for drafts to swagger through inside. Rooms burrowed together, narrow passages, sleeping platforms. Benches pressed into the earth smell of turf that had dried and lost its hint of damp months before. The central hearth taught smoke to seek its path through a roof vent. No tall chimney, but a negotiated gap whose size changed with weather. A turf house sounds different. Wind thumps and then forgets. The room hears its own breathing and decides to keep calm. Even mice seem to move in slower syllables. The absence of a showy fireplace did not mean the absence of strategy. It meant the house itself was the fireplace, the thick walls the mantle, the snow a winter blanket the earth generously lent back, Norway. Timber that talks to the wind where forests were loyal, timber spoke. Norwegian longhouses and farm clusters leaned into post and beam intelligence. Sills lifted the walls away from damp ground. Posts seeded into stones that drained the first insult of rain and melt. Planks laid to overlap so swell and shrink could happen without turning seams into invitations. Moss packed the joints, hand-gathered, hand-pressed, springy with tiny air chambers that make the best insulation, the kind you can repair with a basket and an hour. Rafter pairs met at a ridge pole, and the roof carried whatever the region had to give. Thatch near the gentler coasts, turf where inland frost and sound could be trusted, doors closed with convincing weight. A rebate cut into the jamb answered the door's edge like a palm sealing another palm. Leather or felt let between to make a soft gasket. Hinges, iron if fortune allowed, wood and clever pegs if not, were set so the door did not sag after a season of being shouldered by snow. Porches and wind foyers multiplied near bad weather. Small rooms where a gust could spend itself and fall on the mat before you let it into the company of people and coals. Outbuildings, barn, byre, sheds, were placed to herd the wind as much as to herd chores. A fence here to trip a gale. A woodpile there to be both wall and promise. And fir valleys and along spruce-thick hills. Smoke management took on a craftsman's personality. The roof vent could be choked with a wooden shutter carved to live with wet and still move. A thin board hung from rafters acted like a smoke baffle, persuading the hearth's exhale to drift where it would do least harm to eyes and beams. Over years, soot proofed the timbers, darkening them into a kind of weatherproof leather. There was no mantle to lean on. There was a beam polished by hands that reached up during talk, a human mantle that told stories by the where marks our fingers leave, Greenland, stone that keeps its patience westward. The Greenland Norse set houses like hands around a low fire. Wood became artifacts more than building stock. Stone and turf took the lead. Walls thick enough that you could measure time by the echo of a knock, stone within and without, a turf heart between them, all bound by gravity, craft, and an ongoing conversation with frost. Foundations sat on honesty, wide, well-drained, levelled where the land wanted to tilt. The roof came down low and heavy, a turf pelt stitched over a scantling frame. Its eaves meant less for beauty than for obedience, teaching meltwater to step away from the wall without arguments. Windows shrank toward the serious, narrow slits. Horned and shuttered, or none at all, the light coming from the hearth. The lamps, and one small, well-governed eye in the roof. The sea, furious and generous by turns, gave stone and bone. Whalebone could become a beam that remembered oceans but behaved like a rafter. Sealskin a weatherproof skin that wrapped a door from the storm's teeth. The interior plan moved closer to the logic of sit, work, sleep, preserve, rooms not so much separated as ranked by warmth, with the inner core for the vulnerable and the urgent. The outer margins for stores and tools that did not need as much persuasion to keep their tempers in the cold. Greenland's houses argued less with the wind and more with the soil's slow frost shift. Floors were levelled with patience. Rushes and boards lifted feet away from the earth's winter sigh. Animal spaces, often tied to the human ones, were not lapses in cleanliness but investments in stable temperatures. The hearth smoke, sometimes sulking in weather that pressed hard, was corrected by many small decisions rather than one big chimney. A vent opened a finger. A door curtained and then cracked, a baffle wedged with a sliver. The house felt like a stone listening to its own warmth, refusing drama, favouring endurance. The islands and the sea lanes, Orkney, Faroes, Hebrides between Norway and Iceland, and draped down Scotland's ragged sleeve, island farms took a little from each school and added the ocean's customs. Stone where it lay close to the hand, turf where grass grew fat on salt air, driftwood treated like gold leaf. Winds here refused to come from only one direction. Houses crouched accordingly, low profiles, roofs that pretended to be part of the ground, walls thickened where the gale's voice was known to rise. Doorways faced not the view but the leeward common sense. Sheds were moored to houses with passages you could run in a storm without losing your breath to the sky inside. You met the sea even when you were not looking. Nets dried along beams. Fish racks slept as skeletons in rafters until their season returned. A chest smelled of tar and rope, a smell that means we can go out when weather relents. The hearths were central and stubborn. Lamps burned oil taken from the same sea that could kill you if you forgot your place. If Iceland's turf houses breathe earth and Greenland's houses keep counsel with stone. Orkney and Faroes' homes feel like they are talking quietly with waves even in their sleep, neighbours of the north. Learning without stealing to survive long winters is to be in a classroom that never dismisses you. The Norse noticed what others did well and borrowed forms without pretending they'd invented them. Sami tents and Godus, mobile and intelligent, taught a lesson in low profiles, in skins that turn wind into a brush rather than a blade, in fires that do not need chimneys to be safe if you understand air. Furs worn furin to trap breath. Boots with grass that wicks and warms. Sledges that make snow act like road. These ideas walked back and forth across cultures in the common language of let's not die. Where trade or intermarriage or neighbourliness allowed. Technique swapped quietly. The way a seam is sealed with fat. The way a doorway steps down or up by a handspan to keep drift from marching in. The way a roof layer is started so it becomes a skin, not a stack. The rule was simple. Imitation is manners when it credits wisdom, theft when it steals livelihoods. In the best cases, winter made people modest enough to learn well and proud enough to say thanks, same half. Different accents. What all these houses shared was a creed. Contain air. Tame water. Steer wind. Stretch fuel. Place bodies intelligently. The absence of a grand fireplace made the creed more visible. Heat pulled from an open hearth. Bodies and animals added their wattage. Walls promised not to squander either. Doors held firm, then yielded to guests. Shutters took the weather's hand and turned it gently away. Lamps did their patient orbits over benches where work made spring possible. The winter household was not only a machine for survival. It was a school. In the Viking North, children learned the grammar of cold the way others learn the grammar of a language, by hearing it spoken everywhere, by repeating its sounds until they belonged to the mouth, by being gently corrected until the sense fell into place. Without a grand fireplace to monopolize attention, warmth pulled where people worked, and children lived inside those circles, catching meanings as surely as they caught a mitt tossed across the room. Winter did not dismiss childhood. It tuned it toward steadiness, toward noticing, toward the kind of courage that is more about keeping promises than about loud deeds. Play began as orientation. Snow itself was a teacher with 1,000 games on its tongue. A drift asked to be tunneled. A slope asked to be slid. A smooth yard asked for a line of boot prints so straight that even an elder might nod. Bone skates turned a creak into a silver sentence that children could read, left to right, push by push. A small sled, roped to a belt, became a companion that carried treasures of a winter day, pine cones to feed the hearth's morning persuasion. A crooked stick that would one day be a shepherd's tool in a play the children invented, a stone too handsome to leave. The games taught physics without the word, balance, friction, momentum, the mercy of stopping before the thin ice sings the wrong note. Indoors, play and apprenticeship shared the bench. A child's first spindle was short and forgiving, its wool heavy enough that clumsy drafts still made honest yarn. A first loom band, narrow and bright, meant the small hands had made a useful border that turned fabric into something more finished. Nail binding started with a ring that could become a wristband. Leatherwork began with a patch for a ragged doll's boot. Woodwork, with a spoon that would stir only pretend pots until the handle's feel grew confident. Tools were introduced with ceremony measured in usefulness. This needle is sharp. We respect sharpness. This knife is small. We respect small things because they teach big ones. Respect, in winter, is softer than fear and lasts longer. Chores were scaled like hills a child could climb. A 5-year-old could check pegs by the door, making sure mittens hung properly for drying. A 7-year-old could sweep the strip of floor where snow sneaks in at the threshold. A 9-year-old could measure oats for the morning porridge by the household's accustomed ladle and learn the sound of enough. Older children ran messages. And messages are winter's nerve fibers. Tell Aunt Runa the path by the alder tree is slick. Take her the wedge for her shudder. Ask how her cough slept. They returned with news and, without realizing it, acquired the habit of returning, of not letting tasks trail off into the dark. Learning the houses weather was as important as learning the skies. Children were taught the back-of-the-hand test for drafts. The ear's way of hearing when a shutter chatters because a peg is loose. The eye's knack for reading a slow change in the color of a roof seam that has started to drink water. Listen, an elder would say, the lamp wick is telling you it wants trimming, and the child, hearing the faint spit, would see how sound can be a set of instructions. In this way, winter improves senses that the long light of summer often lets grow lazy, the patience to watch, the courtesy to adjust a small thing before it becomes a large one. Stories braided play and duty together. Riddles lived between tasks. Saga moments were acted in slow corners of the room where a handful of carved figures, whalebone, driftwood, scrap horn, stood in for gods and farmers, ships and storms. A child played at thing with a circle of pebbles and learned that speaking in turn is warmer than shouting over one another. Nefertafel pieces were cousins of chores. Defend the king, guard the path, sacrifice cleverly when the board demands it. The game taught that retreat is not failure, that flanks matter, that a single clever move can make a day easier, a lesson that bled naturally into how to plan a route to the buyer in a storm. Fear, always lurking at the edges of long nights, was domesticated rather than denied. The house made rituals of reassurance. A small lamp was left burning by the sleeping platforms until first sleep took hold. A charm carved on a beam got a touch from a child's finger on nights the wind poured the door. A mug of warm water with a flake of salt sat near a cough. Elders told the older sagas with care, lingering on the parts where cleverness trumped brute force, where hospitality ended hunger, where patience outlasted winter. Children learned the difference between a story that leaves a room colder and one that leaves it warmer, and they learned to ask for the latter. Outside, small braveries were rehearsed under a large sky. A child went with a parent to break the lip of ice on a trough and was trusted to swing the stick that knocks the thin plate clean. Another carried the warm water bucket and watched steam thicken into fog that smelled faintly of iron and straw. A third learned where to stand when a gate is opened so animals do not misunderstand the invitation. Bravery, measured here, looked like standing still at the right moment, or like admitting a mitten is wet before it becomes a dangerous chill, or like speaking up when the path seems wrong even though legs. Prideful, wish to continue. The curriculum of breath was specific. In through the nose, out through the mouth, under the scarf, someone would murmur before a short walk in hard weather, and children grew the habit of arranging their face against wind as if it were a tool. They learned to sit tall when coughing so lungs could do their winter work, to sip broth slowly so warmth travelled farther, to hold a hand over the mouth when stepping outside so the first bite of air would be gentler. These seem small, but winter is a summation of smalls. A child who knows how to breathe in cold is a house with fewer sleepless nights. Language itself was part of training. Children gathered the winter words that adults use as levers: bank, vent, wick, seam, draft, seep, settle. They learned that tight can be praise for a shudder and worry for a chest. That light can mean weight, illumination, and generosity, all meanings necessary when deciding whether to add a log or weight, whether to move a lamp or trim it, whether to share the last slice of dried apple now or save it for a sadder hour. Words also kept company with hands, steady over a bowl when a child poured, and enough when the measure met the day's ration. Mistakes were folded into lessons without humiliation. A forgotten peg led to a damp mitten. The child hung the mitten over the right place and learned to press the cuff open so air moves through. A too eager shove of a log sent sparks. A sober talk about banking calls followed, and the poker was demonstrated again. Not jabbing, nudge, see. An ice misstep earned a sore knee and 3 pieces of advice about walking on crust, and then a story about the time an elder fell in the same place. Worse, in a year when the wind argued more. Winter's justice is gentle when the cost is small and firm when the cost threatens everyone. Children sensed that balance and grew toward it. Festivals and markers punctuated the long semester. Midwinter rites, evergreens set near the hearth. Simple gifts handed palm to palm. A song sung on a pitch that invited even shy voices, taught that time still moves. Children made the decorations that could be afforded. A braided straw sun to hang on a beam. A bright tablet-woven band around a lamp base. A carved bird tied near a window to remind the room of flight when nothing flew. Doing made the day different from the last, which is medicine. We made this is warmer than we waited. The village pressed its wider imprint. A child sent with an older cousin to deliver a spool of thread learned the map between houses, where the path runs out of the wind, where the snow forms a step over a fence that in summer is an inconvenience. At a neighbor's door, the child learned the law of the door from the other side, to knock the way people knock here, to step in without bringing the weather along, to accept a warm drink and a piece of news and then to leave without leaning too hard on hospitality that must stretch through the week. These travels made citizens out of children. Citizenship is winter's favorite survival trick, and there was, even in the deep months, nonsense, blessed nonsense. A hat with a silly tuft. A puppet crudely stitched that spoke with a grand chief's voice. A game played by tossing a bone button and calling out animals in a contest that meant nothing but made the room bright and saved a scrap of lamp fat from being spent on gloom. Laughter is not an extra. It is a fuel that asks very little in return. By spring, the children were older in more ways than their height confessed. They could tie a fisherman's knot and a mitten cord. They knew the safe seconds for opening a shutter to freshen the air. They could find the warmest bench with their eyes closed because they could hear how the house breathed. They had helped mind stores and learned the moral arithmetic of some now, some later. They had watched a lamb stand and learned the shape of relief. They had learned to walk back to the door when the weather changed its mind, and to talk back to fear with a ritual they trusted. The long night had not merely been endured. It had been used, turned into skills and habits, into songs known by heart and stitches neat enough to be proud of. In lands where winter writes long chapters, the ability to read the page before it is turned becomes a form of warmth. The Vikings did not have barometers with needles or towers with clocks that told the wind what to do. They had eyes, ears, skin, and a library of observations passed from mouth to mouth until they settled into the body as habit. Without a grand fireplace to drown a room in confident blaze, households learned a different confidence, that the weather can be read, persuaded, prepared for. Weathercraft was not magic. It was attention practiced so faithfully that it felt like kinship with the sky. The first text was the horizon. In the short light months, dawn arrived like a rumor, and yet its color told a careful reader whether the day would travel gently or pick up its skirts and run with the storm. A pale, pewter band that brightened evenly promised steady cold without new trouble. A lurid red, too eager, too theatrical, was stormlight reflected from an army of clouds still marching in from sea or ice. You stirred the porridge a little quicker and tightened the door curtain with more care. On days when the east had no edge, sky and ground blending into a single whiteness, you bent to close work and saved long chores for tomorrow. Because the horizon was telling you the world was between breaths and had no patience for walkers, clouds carried dialects, and elders acted as translators. Mackerel sky, they'd say of small, stippled ranks high above, a fair weather pattern, cold and brittle, that made sound travel oddly far and made children call out to hear their own voices change. Low, smooth slabs, layered like a whale's slow ribs, could mean snow that settled like a polite guest and helped roof and field without trying to break either one. Ragged-bottomed darks rushing low over the ridge made a different argument. Wind would find every seam, and shutters must be wedged now, not later. After a while, the eye stopped naming and simply recognized. The hand found the right peg for the right day. Wind wrote in fences and trees. A strand of wool snagged on a thorn and lifted at a particular angle meant the breeze would veer before noon. Smoke from the roof vent told truth more plainly than any instrument. If it drifted up and then fell flat along the roof, the air aloft was cold and heavy. If it lifted in a straight column and frayed at the top, a high, orderly cold held sway, good for travel, bad for fingers. If it dithered and curled and then returned into the vent in small, sulky tumbles, wind played tricks nearby and snow would likely arrive sideways. You banked the coals toward the hearth's lee side, you moved the lamp, you told the child tasked with water to wait for your word. The snow itself was a weather glass. Powder squeaked under boots when the cold had sharpened past ordinary. Runners sang on it with a bright tone and refused to grip unless fed a little tallow. The crust that forms after a day of sun and a night of bossy cold told stories by how it failed. A single, crisp snap under 1 foot meant new snow would come to hide your embarrassment. A sequence of soft collapses meant trapped warmth below and the possibility of treachery on slopes. In the yard, the drift at the buyer's corner acted like a dated page. You could judge the season's pace by where its top met the wall. Too high too early, and you refigured your woodpile in your head. Too low too late, and you rationed gratitude for a gentle year. Ice spoke in music. A new skin on the trough tapped like a shallow drum. A river's thickening sang a low, metallic note that carried through the boots and up the shin. Lake ice, old and layered, made whale voices under stars that made even adults step closer to each other. Cracks were letters, not warnings by themselves. A dry, zigzag line inside strong ice will shout and be harmless. A glossdark opening near a spring will whisper and be treacherous. Children learned the difference the way they learned letters, traced first by a guiding hand, then by their own. With someone watching from a few steps away, animals gave forecasts because they do not lie to themselves. Sheep that turned their broad sides against a wind and stood quiet for an hour knew the weather would hold there. Crows that rode a gust with their wings set and then dropped into trees near midday were calling an early dusk. Dogs that paced and then chose to sleep near the door told you that the world outside would be nosy tonight and try to come in. Cows' breaths steamed in larger plumes before certain snows. Horses' coats seemed to lift a fraction when pressure changed, as if they were rereading the day sentence and deciding to stand a word closer to one another. Sound travelled oddly according to the air's intentions. On knife-cold mornings, an axe's ring carried 3 fields away, making neighbours greet you in the afternoon with, "You're mending the fence," before you'd told them. In soft, falling snow, the world's noises crowded close, intimate, boots like a polite knock, voices like lamps. Wind can fold voices back toward the door so that a conversation at the woodpile arrives in the kitchen before the person speaking does. Wind can also pull speech out through the roof seam as if it were smoke. The householder learned to test not just drafts but acoustics. A room that swallowed sound more than usual needed venting. A yard that made a shout sound small asked for caution if you plan a trip. Timekeeping was weatherkeeping. In winter you knew noon not by the sun's height, too low, too brief, but by the slump of shadows along the south wall. You split the day by chores that teach pace, the length of a rushlight, the time it takes barley to turn from stiff to willing, the way a lamp's reservoir draws down from one scratched mark to the next. Between first sleep and second, weather often changed its mind. The one who rose to tend the coals looked into the roof vent and read whether stars sharpened or smudged, whether the moon's halo thickened, a ring that meant snow preparing itself beyond the ridge. Buckling on its belt, preparation turned forecast into comfort. A day that hinted at wind meant pegs tested, a shutter wedged with a sliver, a door latch rubbed so it would not freeze sulky at dawn. A day that smelled like big snow meant paths pre-cut deeper, tools moved where they would be found under a white sheet, sled runners retallowed, a second kettle set near to speed evening broth. A day that promised bright cold turned indoor tasks toward fine work, needles threaded, small repairs begun, because too much going out and back would spend more heat than the day could earn. Weathercraft is not merely knowing. It is rearrangement. There were omens, too, that lived in the space where observation becomes story. A halo with dogs, mock suns, set people watchful, not superstitious. They checked roofs and reconciled with the fact of more light later in the year, not now. Aurora, when it danced sharply, felt like a proclamation that the high air was restless and that Earth would hear about it soon. Shoes were set nearer the door. A raven calling 3 times and then flying low along the lee of a hill convinced a scald to choose a shorter tale that evening. Who can say why, but the house slept well. Even in the pragmatic winter, poetry laid a hand on the shoulder of weather and found it solid. Tools for reading the day were humble. A stick by the door marks snow depth to a child's height. When it reaches your elbow, you do not go to the river. A thread of wool hung near a vent told humidity with its curl. A small, polished plate set on a sill showed the sky as a wide lens. Elders read it without craning their necks, saving warmth stored in scarf and hood. The back of the hand test for drafts had its cousin at the door, a palm held at the threshold while a helper lifted and closed the latch, measuring the leak with skin alone. None of this was grand, yet all of it added up to a room that behaved kindly and a day that did not surprise anyone into foolishness. The village multiplied foresight. A neighbor's flag of laundry, briefly dared and then snatched down, told you that a gust had found a trick angle at the older grove. A boy's red cheeks and watery eyes at your door told you the path across the meadow punished faces and that you should loop through the birches instead. The smith's decision to cover his stray iron with a skin before dusk told you snow with a wet heart would fall and stick to everything indiscriminately. Weathercraft, like any craft, is a guild. Everyone is a member in winter. Mistakes were recorded and made into future caution. The day someone misread a bright morning and went to the far wood just as a low snow sprang from behind the ridge became a family story not of blame but of remedy. How the extra path stones, set like breadcrumbs in autumn, saved the return. How the bell at the threshold kept ringing in the wind so the sound walked out to meet the lost feet. How a robe hung by the door saved shivers from becoming fever. The ledger of weather includes debt and payment, error and correction, but never despair. Despair is the weather you make indoors, and winter has enough of its OWN.BY late winter. Readers grew bolder because they were backed by practice. You learned to flirt with a thaw, move barrels, chip channels so melt would run where you wanted, pull snow away from the wall so the first bright drip did not turn to sneaky damp. You learned to expect betrayal. A thaw that courts you and then turns hard will make knife ice. You spread ash at dusk and told children that running would be a summer sport today. You learned the smell of a season about to change, the wet mineral note that rises from ground long held quiet, the way wood creaks optimistically under sun and then sighs when night takes its tax again. The sea rests differently than land. Even when ice sheathes a fjord or when storm lines pace the horizon like stern judges, the water beneath remembers motion, and those who live by it remember, too. In Viking winters, when voyagers shrank to errands and the coast spoke more in frost than in foam, ships did not vanish from the story. They turned inward with their people, without a grand fireplace to claim the room's center. Warmth gathered in smaller circles, around benches where ropes were dressed, in sheds where hulls breathed the clean smell of tar and wood, at tables where charts were not ink but memory made orderly. The boat slept, yes, but like dogs with one ear open. Hauling came first, in the late autumn hours when the sea let you and the sky agreed to wait. A hull was urged up the shingle on greased skids, men and women leaning and singing in a rhythm that taught the keel to take land's weight without complaint. Where coasts were kind and custom old, a Norsed, stone or turf-lined boat shed waited like a cradle set into the shore. Inside, the ship found its winter shape, keel resting on stout stocks, strake supported by uprights that knew precisely where ribs wanted kindness. In less lavish places, a simple linter, a windward wall, a careful cover of oiled skins and woven mats, anything that taught whether to be a visitor, not a roommate, sails a winter's first petitioners. Unbent from mast and yard, they were dried and aired, folded along creases that did not break the fabric's memory, and stored where mice could not imagine a nursery. Woolen sails, fat with lanolin and old spray, were brushed and mended, a frayed reef point replaced, an eyelet rewoven, a patch laid so its woven grain ran in the right sympathy with the cloth it healed. Hemp lines were coiled, flaked, and hung where air could move through them. A lazy dried rope is a sulker in spring. A properly dried one starts the season with good manners. Tar spoke winter's most persuasive language. Pitch and pine tar, warmed careful so they did not scorch, went into the seams where oakum, hemp or animal hair teased and rubbed with tar, had been driven the season before. Caulking irons and mallets took up their winter song. Tap, set, tap, smooth. The sound joined the longhouse's quiet orchestra. Loom, lamp, child's breath, small hammer, and the smell of tar-joined smoke and wool in the catalogue of honest comforts. A seam that had learned bad habits in a hard sea was made to confess and then forgiven with care, a thin bead laid like a benediction. Tar on rope, too, palms and leather gloves stroking a long line until the fibres darkened and grew sleek and weather-tight again. The way a pelt grows richer when brushed, would remember journeys in scars that winter taught you to read. An adze kissed a plank until a proud place lay down and agreed again with the fairness of the hull. Thole pins, those modest uprights that let in or keep its promise, were counted and set aside in a small box like prize teeth. Spares were carved smooth with the sort of attention that makes spring launches brave. Oars were checked where palms had burned and salted, their looms thinned where pride had made a rower careless, their blades trued so they would not fight the water out of spite. A split found now saved a swim later. Winter's arithmetic loved such economies. Iron, too, asked for audience. Rivets and clenched nails, their tails turned tidy against the inside of planks, were inspected with an eye and a fingertip. A whisper of orange where rust had tried for courtship was rubbed away, and oil talked the iron back into loyalty. A gudgeon that held a rudder's pintle was argued with until it sat honest. A ringbolt that had learned to wobble was given a new shim and a better bed. The little forge, fussy with fuel and air, was woken only when necessary, just enough heat to soften, to straighten, to remind iron what shape it had agreed to live in winter weather taught a second seamanship on land. The roof of a Norse learned to shed snow without throwing it onto a wading hole. The door's lower board lifted and set so drifts would not weld it shut. A path was cut from boatshed to longhouse that turned the wind into a companion rather than an opponent. When thaw made mischief and refroze into treachery, ash went down in a thin thread that showed boots and sleds the right line. The yard spoke to the sea through preparations, spars laid where hands could find them without wrestling. Balers and buckets nested. The small chest of awls, splicing fids, sail needles, wax, and palm guards wrapped and set in a place where even a child could fetch it at night without fumbling. Rope work was winter schoolhouse, full of puzzles with friendly answers. Splicers ate their tails and vanished into continuity. Whipping kept line ends from becoming hair in a storm's mouth. Knots remembered their names: sheep bend, clove hitch, bowline, under fingers that practiced by lamp. Even children had their curriculum, a length of cord and a game of tie what I say without looking. Laughter when the living room turned into a forest of harmless loops and ends. In spring, such games become reflexes, movements that happen before the mind has time to argue, which is how safety often arrives. Charts lived in heads more than on hides. Even so, winter drew lines in talk the way summer drew them in wake. From the Raven Rock you steer a hand inside the skerry that looks like a seal. In fog, count 10 slow breaths after you hear the surf change its letter. Markers were stories, and stories were wayfinding technologies as reliable as any compass when repeated across many winters. The star lessons were told again on clear nights by the door, the steady eye in the north, the leans and arcs of familiar constellations. How to take a bearing from a shoulder of hill and the remembered set of the wind on mornings like this one. Children practiced with a strip of bone scratched with lines, their private lodestone of imagined voyages. Even a sleeping ship eats a little. Leather shrinks. Lashings loosen. Covers flap and chafe. So winter made a ritual of rounds. Once each week, or after a storm, which is the more honest calendar, someone walked the shed and the shore with a basket of small fixes, new wedges for a block's cheek, felt for a chafe guard under a line that must cross a sharp, a sliver of wood to lift a plank where meltwater has developed an impudent habit. These were minutes that spring paid back like generous interest. The sea remained a presence even under ice. Fjords glazed into plains useful for sled runners, but breathing holes told you the water was alive, and the ice itself sang sermons in low metallic vowels. If a thaw turned a margin slushy and then froze it into glass, the prudent household set fenders of withies along the posts so tidal tick could not bruise a beached hull. If a storm scoured ice out to sea in a night, someone said thank you by setting the yard in order. Gratitude and tidiness keep better company than gratitude and boasting. Community gathered around boats with its own cheerful lore. A hauling day was everyone's day. A setting day in spring, the same. You brought your strength and your songs and, later, a pot and a ladle, and the sea honoured the labour with a launch that went straight and sweet. Winter's part of that contract was the shared borrowing of hands and tools, your caulking mallet for my awl, my spare sail palm for your best marlin spike. A boat is never truly one family's property in such places. It is a village instrument, and the village keeps it in tune through winter so it can play its summer song without sour notes. There were elegances that winter permitted. A figurehead, if the boat had one, might be lifted down and brought to the bench. A crack across the snout of a dragon or the curl of a bird's crest was coaxed back together. Paint, or the northern ancestor of it, a stain of soot and oil, refreshed the lines until they looked like myth again. Not for vanity, but for morale. Ornament is a form of fuel that burns slowly and keeps a household human. A name carved deeper in a thwart, a charm knotted into a line. A small pouch lashed where it would touch every or pulled. Ritual makes tools loyal. And winter has time for rituals done without boast. Food and sea met in the workshop's conversation. Hooks were sharpened and counted into little bundles. Net floats checked for cracks. A new, clever tweak to a dragnet's lead line tried in miniature on the floor so arguments could be solved without wet feet. Someone told the story of a catch that arrived because of a knot tied right in a blow. Someone else corrected the knot and improved the story. In this way, technique migrated down benches, and spring inherited more than repaired gear. It inherited improved minds. The absence of a tall, theatrical fireplace only made the boat shed's warmth more particular. A brazier-shy glow, a lamp hung where it threw friendly light on a seam, the shared breath of people bent to tasks, these made a climate of their own. You work a little, you hold your hands over the little heat, you listen to the roof tick as ice loosens and refreezes, you tie another splice. A ship kept so will answer with gratitude when the year turns. It will not take on water out of spite. It will not blame its people for neglect. It will respond to the first spring push with the happy creak of wood in its native element. Winter loosens by degrees, like a careful knot you can feel give under your fingers. In the Viking North, the first signs came as small courtesies rather than declarations, a softer note in the eaves where icicles tapped, a darker stripe at the foot of a drift, a smell from the yard that was not quite snow anymore but not yet grass, mineral, wet, promising. A household that had survived without the theatre of a grand fireplace knew how to greet this slow change with the same intelligence it had used to enter winter months ago. Thaw is not an event. It is a choreography of release. Each step saves the next from waste, and together they turn endurance into renewal. The morning ritual altered first. When the lid lifted from the coals, the glow answered more readily, as if the ash had grown less stubborn. Kindling needed less persuasion, and the kettle's breath rose sooner. Windows, those small, disciplined mouths, were cracked a finger's width a little earlier. A lamp that had been necessary between first and second sleep now rested more often, its wick trimmed and its dish cleaned as if given a holiday. The house's own breathing changed. Where once draughts were enemies to be banished, a measured exchange of air became medicine, unbraiding the damp that winter had woven into corners and beams. Cleaning in spring is not vanity. It is inspection disguised as gratitude. Bedding was carried outside, shaken with a solemn cheerfulness, and set on lines that had been cleared of their wind's winter tricks. Straw ticks were opened and retied with fresh fill. Wool blankets combed with a blunt bone to lift their nap and lay the winter flat. Floors, plank or tamped earth, were swept down to scents, everything removable taken up so the broom could learn the shape of the room anew. Ash that had been banker, insulator, and polish turned into a last helper, scattered thin on slicks that thaw and refreeze, stirred into lye water to scrub trestles and spoons, crossed over the threshold in a small ritual to say, "Work is easier now. We remember what you did." The hearth itself was reintroduced to summer manners. Stones were lifted and reset where freezing had taught them mischief. The shallow trench that fed air through coals was cleared of winter's small hoardings. Soot, which had been a proof against damp, was brushed where it grew too proud, and beams were read like old friends, cracks memorized, soft spots pressed with a knowing thumb. A baffle or roof vent shutter was repaired as part of thanks, not scolding. The longhouse did not have a chimney to purge. It had a throat to soothe, and spring is when you pour a little warm oil into the voice that has spoken all winter without complaint. Snow management reversed itself. Where banks had been encouraged to guard walls, they were now cut back a spade's width at a time, and a channel was chipped to lead meltwater along a friendly path toward a barrel or into a hollow that would be grateful for mud. Roof edges were watched for that particular deceit when a thaw shaves the bond between snow and turf, and then a night's freeze turns the loosened sheet into a sliding blade. A broom's but tapped the eaves lightly and often, not to punish them but to remind them to let go gently. Children were given the small braveries: carry this ash and lay a thread here. Stand where the ground is sure while I knock this drift down. Tell me where the water goes when I pour it here. Tools and stores emerged into light like winter sleepers. The woodpile, scored by the season's long subtraction, was surveyed with the same equanimity applied in autumn. What remains, what was learned, what the next year's stack should look like to answer the truths this year had confessed. Sleds were thanked and stood aside. Carts rolled nearer and were persuaded out of sulks with grease and a plain word or two. Rope hung for months indoors was brought out and allowed the courtesy of sun. The smell of tar woke in it like an old song. Nets that had spent winter in dry lamplight were aired and checked rind to rind so the first fish of spring would not be made into a sad story about a tear that should have been seen. Clothing stepped down a layer, and the house minded the change like a cautious doctor. An extra shirt was removed only after midday had proved its honesty. Cloaks were hung nearer the door but not forgotten, because spring bites harder than winter when pride walks too far. Boots were cleaned of the salt and sand that had kept them honest, then fed with fats until leather shone and remembered softness without losing its good winter sense. Mittens were examined for tales told by palms and thumbs. Repairs finished not for today's weather but for the day next winter when you will be grateful you did them now. Animals told their own version of the season. Breath plumes shrank. Coats shook a little easier. Hooves found ground that was not as hard as iron or as sly as glass. The buyer's air, moderated all winter, asked for freshening. Doors propped. Bedding turned more often as thaw taught the nose a new arithmetic. Milk tasted faintly different, as if the cows were remembering green through their tongues. Lambs, if they had come in the late weeks, were moved briefly into sun like bright thoughts. Each young animal was a rehearsal of summer, and the household watched them with a gravity that had laughter folded into it. Water took on work it had been denied. Barrels that had sulked under lids now drank from roofs. A channel scratched in packed earth by the door taught runoff to visit the garden patch rather than the threshold. A bucket stood under a spot that counted drips and turned them into a steady usefulness. The first trickle of a real stream noise from beyond the byre sounded like someone speaking your name in another room. Laundry, real washing, not the winter strategic dabbings, began on days chosen by sky and wind, with soap that had frozen in its jar but thawed to duty. Shirts and linens flapped with a dignity earned, their edges cutting a wet brightness into the yard. Food softened, too. The crocks of sour vegetables that had carried the house through long weeks were celebrated and then retired in favour of the year's earliest tender things, a fist of chives. A pale sprout rescued from the shadow of a wall, a last apple saved from the cool dark. Barley porridge met nettle, milk met the season's first sweetness. The hearth favoured quickness over endurance. Lids lifted more often, and steam ran light on the air rather than heavy. Lamps burned briefer evenings, their wicks trimmed in a gesture that felt like setting a book aside at a good stopping place. The ledger of winter was audited with kindness. Tallies that had ruled the cold months shrank into notes about what to plant, what to barter, who to thank. A neighbour who had come often through snow to help with water buckets received seed or a bedded tool. A household that had mended your door felt their latch lifted and their hinge pinned smooth. Debts were paid in work and in stories. Remember the night the roof sang? Come eat. Bring your clever child. We have a rope trick to teach. The law of the door stood, unchanged, but it breathed easier, as if the latch itself had learned to smile. Work moved outward. Paths widened in a single afternoon. Pegs near the door yielded their forest of mittens to a lighter thicket of caps. The garden woke like an old friend who stretches before speaking. A spade found ground that accepted it with a grunt instead of a shriek. Manure heaps, banked and steaming under snow for months, were turned and spoken to the soil in words that were mostly the shovel sound. Fences rattled secrets they had kept under ice, and those secrets were nailed quiet. The roof was climbed, not as siege but as courtship, ridges padded, vents set just so, turf preened where winter had mussed it. Inside, the longhouse rearranged itself to summer's grammar. The sleeping platforms kept their modest wisdom, but blankets stepped back and invited dreams to breathe. The loom took more of the light, weaving plans as much as cloth. The bench where spoons had been shaped turned to pegs and handles and the small pieces that boats and gates and carts always need. The hearth, still central, still honest, lost none of its importance for having less to prove. It became again a kitchen, a lamplighter, a giver of quick heat rather than a conservator of deep, bank time. Without a chimney's pomp, it had always been about adequacy and reliability. Spring simply widened its company. The mind, too, thawed. Songs lifted a key. Stories favoured episodes with boats pushing off and fields turning ribs to rose. A scald included endings that start things again. Children ran and returned and ran again, reporting discoveries that sound silly and are, in truth, holy, a beetle alive under a stone. A patch of brown that was warm to the touch. A puddle perfect for the first test of a bone skate as a boat. Work's pace quickened, but it kept winter's courtesy. Rests were still rests. Water still asked for warming before you handed it to a tired person. The day still ended with a look at the roof seam and a small nod of satisfaction that if winter had a moral, conserve, arrange, respect, spring had one, too, renew without boasting. The house that breathed all winter earned the right to yawn and open its eyes. The family that tended coals earned the right to cook without counting every chip. The village that kept its law at the door earned the right to host a day where benches crowded, songs grew louder, and a clean, brave log was burned simply because joy needs rituals as much as hunger does. What changed in spring was not the truth that warmth comes from attention. Only the objects of attention changed their positions on the stage. Winter in the far north was never conquered. It was courted, understood, and lived with. The Vikings did not lean on chimneyed fireplaces with theatrical flames. They leaned on craft, on order, on neighbours, on animals that shared their breath, on walls that learned to hold still, on lamps that gave just enough light to finish one more stitch, one more story. Warmth was not a single blaze, but 1,000 arrangements, turf folded over timber, moss pressed into seams, wool layered over linen. Coals banked like a promise, broth kept just below a boil until it could pass its heat into a quiet body that we watched the longhouse become a machine for patience. Sleeping platforms raised above cold air. Hearth embers stretched from dusk to dawn, wind turned aside by fences and woodpiles. Food preserved in summer and released in winter by careful hands. We followed paths across ice and snow, and then back again to the door where law and kindness live. We saw ships sleeping under tar and canvas, children learning winter's grammar stitch by stitch and step by step, and the sky itself, legible to anyone who will read its edges. Finally, the first thaw loosened the knots of the dark months, not with trumpets but with drips, with steam rising from puddles, with the house opening its small windows by a finger's breadth and breathing again. What survives the cold is not only a body kept warm. It is a household kept decent, a village kept honest, a memory kept orderly so that the next long night is less frightening than the last. And when spring returns, It is greeted by people who are still themselves, tired, perhaps, but unbroken, humbler, perhaps, but more exact. There is no grand fireplace in this story, only the steady ember of human attention. It is enough. It always was.